The sun sat high and merciless above the clay rooftops and wooden planks of Dry Creek, casting shadows sharp enough to cut skin. The market square buzzed with quiet cruelty as Karen Dalton stood bound to the center post, wrists raw against the sun-scorched rope, her back straight, though her legs had begun to tremble. Sweat carved lines down her dusty skin, but her eyes remained hollow and unbroken. "Bring the sinner before God's judgment." Pastor Collins's voice rolled across the square like distant thunder. He stood atop the stone well, Bible clutched to his chest, face flushed with righteous fervor beneath the punishing New Mexico sun. The crowd tightened around the post faces, twisted with a particular kind of pleasure that only comes from watching someone else's suffering. A boy no older than 10 darted forward, pocket knife in hand, aiming for Karen's long auburn braid. "Cut it! Cut the witch's hair!" someone shouted. Before the blade could reach her, a hand caught the boy's wrist. Young Sheriff James Wade stood there, his badge gleaming against his dusty vest. He wasn't much older than Karen herself, perhaps 29 or 30. "That's enough, Billy," Wade said quietly, prying the knife from the boy's fingers. "The judgment's to stand at the post, nothing more." The boy's father pushed forward. "Since when does a sheriff tell us how to handle Dalton trash?" Wade's jaw tightened, but he said nothing, stepping back as Pastor Collins descended from the well. "This woman," Collins proclaimed, pointing a bony finger at Karen, "carries the sin of her father like a disease. Henry Dalton has poisoned our wells, broken our windows, threatened our women with his drunken rages. And his daughter," his voice dropped to a theatrical whisper, "has made no amends." Karen stared straight ahead, her green eyes fixed on something distant beyond the crowd. 22 years old, with the weathered hands of someone much older, and the straight spine of someone who had learned early that bending meant breaking. Mayor Whitmore stepped forward, a tall man with a meticulously trimmed silver beard and the bearing of someone accustomed to command. His Union Army pin still adorned his vest pocket, though the war between the states had ended 8 years prior. "Miss Dalton owes restitution for damages to town property," Whitmore announced. "The broken storefront at Jenkins's apothecary, the contaminated well on 3rd Street, and the medical supplies ruined in her father's last episode." He adjusted his coat sleeves. "Until such time as payment is made, she will stand as an example to those who would shirk their civic responsibilities." "She is just like her daddy," one woman sneered from beneath a lace parasol. "That girl is Henry Dalton's blood, no mistaking it," another added, folding her arms. "He used to smash liquor bottles over people's heads and laugh like it was a Sunday hymn." Karen said nothing. She did not plead, did not look down. Her eyes, once bright with schoolroom dreams, held only the weary stillness of someone long since resigned. No one remembered she had once taught letters to the rancher's children, or that she had stitched wounds with steady hands when the doctor was too drunk to hold a needle. They forgot how she had bowed to every debt her father left behind, swallowing pride like dry ash. Now, without coin to repay the damages of her father's last rampage, she was punished, as if the sins were carved into her own skin. Sheriff Wade scanned the crowd, discomfort evident in his posture. His eyes met Karen's briefly, and something like apology flashed across his face before he looked away. 10 miles outside Dry Creek, Daniel Mercer stood on his porch, watching storm clouds gather over the distant mesas. His ranch sat isolated among red rocks and scrubby pines, the nearest neighbor 3 miles east. At 53, the years had etched deep lines around his eyes and mouth, but had not diminished the intensity of his gaze nor the strength in his broad shoulders. He'd ridden into town only twice in the past month, speaking to no one beyond what was necessary to purchase supplies. Most folks were content to leave him be. The former federal judge, who'd hanged men during the war years, wasn't someone to trouble without cause. The wind shifted, carrying distant sounds, horses, voices raised. Daniel's hand instinctively moved to the Colt revolver at his hip, a habit from years when justice was delivered swiftly and finally. His ranch hand, Miguel Rodriguez, approached from the barn. "Trouble in town, senor," he said, wiping sweat from his brow. "My cousin just rode through. They've got Henry Dalton's daughter tied to the market post." Daniel's expression didn't change, but his fingers tightened almost imperceptibly on the porch railing. "What's the charge?" "Her father's debts. Mayor says she's responsible." Miguel spat into the dust. "The real sin is her teaching Mexican children to read. Whitmore doesn't want educated workers harder to cheat them that way." Daniel was silent for a long moment, eyes fixed on the distant horizon where Dry Creek lay beyond the rolling hills. Then he turned steps heavy as he entered the cabin. On the mantel stood a daguerreotype in a simple wooden frame. A woman with her hair pulled back severely, eyes fierce and unyielding. Elizabeth Lisbeth Mercer had been dead 5 years, but Daniel still spoke to her portrait some nights when the silence grew too heavy. "What would you have me do, Lisbeth?" he murmured, touching the frame lightly. The woman in the image seemed to stare back with a challenge in her eyes. Daniel knew what she would say. The same words she'd spoken before pneumonia took her when the town doctor had refused to treat the Yankee judge's abolitionist wife until it was too late. "Find someone else who needs kindness, Daniel. Don't let them make you cold." He took his hat from its peg and settled it firmly on his head. The market square had begun to empty as the afternoon heat intensified. Only the most dedicated spectators remained to watch Karen's public humiliation. Her legs had given out an hour earlier, forcing her to kneel in the dust, though her back remained straight as a ramrod. Pastor Collins had retreated to the shade of his church, but occasionally emerged to shout a verse about the wages of sin across the square. Mayor Whitmore had long since returned to his office, the day's justice dispensed to his satisfaction. Sheriff Wade lingered at the edge of the square, hat pulled low over his eyes. He'd brought her water once, earning a scowl from Collins, but otherwise seemed paralyzed between duty and decency. The sound of hoofbeats drew all eyes to the eastern edge of the square. A tall figure on horseback appeared silhouetted against the harsh afternoon sun. As he rode closer, conversation stilled and the remaining onlookers drew back. Daniel Mercer dismounted unhurriedly, tying his horse to a hitching post with deliberate movements. He wore a long duster coat, despite the heat, and the silver handle of his Colt caught the sunlight as he turned. A woman gasped. "It's the hanging, Judge," she whispered, though not quietly enough. Daniel ignored them all, his weathered boots stirring dust as he crossed the square. His eyes, gray as gunmetal, were fixed on Karen, not with pity, not with judgment, just a quiet, assessing calm. Karen raised her head slowly, meeting his gaze. There was no pleading in her expression, no expectation of rescue, merely the dignity of someone who had learned to endure. From his saddlebag, Daniel pulled a loaf of bread wrapped in cloth. Without speaking, he approached the post. The remaining crowd drew back further, sensing something momentous about to occur. With the gentlest motion, as if laying a baby down to sleep, he set the bread on Karen's lap. Then he moved behind her and loosened the knot with steady hands. The rope slipped away like it had never belonged there. Karen didn't move immediately, her wrists marked with angry red welts. Daniel stepped back, still silent. Then he turned and walked away. Not hurried, not afraid. Just a man who had done what he came to do. Pastor Collins burst from the church. "What is the meaning of this?" he demanded, Bible clutched to his chest like a shield. "That woman has not fulfilled her obligation to this town." Daniel paused, but didn't turn. "The obligation," he said, voice low and rough from disuse, "was never hers to fulfill." Sheriff Wade stepped forward, hand resting uncertainly on his gun belt. "Judge Mercer, the mayor's orders were—" "I'm not a judge anymore." Daniel cut him off. "And that," he nodded toward the post, "isn't justice." Without another word, he mounted his horse and rode away, leaving the town to its stunned silence. Karen remained kneeling, the bread warm in her lap, her expression unreadable as she watched her unlikely savior disappear. Karen's legs shook with each step. As she made her way home, the loaf of bread clutched to her chest like something precious. The sun had begun its descent, painting the adobe walls of Dry Creek with golden light that belied the town's harsh nature. The Dalton cabin stood at the edge of town, its weathered planks and sagging roof a testament to years of neglect. Once it had been part of a modest but respectable property that included 10 acres of land suitable for farming. Now only the cabin and 2 acres remained, the rest sold off, piece by piece, to pay for Henry Dalton's liquor and gambling debts. As Karen approached, she could hear her father's drunken singing from within. She paused at the door, gathering strength before pushing it open. Henry Dalton lay sprawled on his cot, an empty bottle at his side. At 48, he looked 70, his face bloated, eyes yellowed, Confederate uniform jacket worn despite fighting only 6 months before deserting, stained and threadbare. "They let you go," he slurred, struggling to focus on his daughter. "Someone cut me loose," Karen said quietly, moving to the water bucket. She dipped a rag and began to clean the rope burns on her wrists. Henry gave a wheezing laugh. "Bet it was that coward Wade. Boy's sweet on you." It was Judge Mercer. The name sobered Henry instantly. He pushed himself upright, spilling the bottle. "Mercer, the hanging judge. What's he want with you?" "Nothing, he just gave me bread and left." Karen held up the loaf as evidence. Henry's bloodshot eyes narrowed with suspicion. "Stay away from him. Men like that don't do favors without expecting something in return." Karen said nothing, knowing argument was pointless. She set about preparing a meager supper from the bread and the few vegetables remaining in their garden. As she worked, her mind returned to the moment when Daniel Mercer had looked at her, not with disgust or pity, but with something like recognition. The memories came unbidden as Karen lay on her thin pallet that night, listening to her father's rasping snores. She was 10 years old again, watching her mother pack a small valise by lamplight. "Take me with you," young Karen had pleaded, clutching her mother's skirts. Sarah Dalton had knelt, cupping her daughter's face with trembling hands. "I can't, my love. Where I'm going, it's no place for a child." "Then don't go." Sarah had glanced fearfully toward the door, where Henry might return any moment. Her eye was still swollen shut from the previous night's beating. "I have to. But listen to me, Karen." Her mother's voice had grown fierce. "You're stronger than he is. Remember that. And someday you'll build a home where no one is judged for things they cannot help." The next morning, Sarah was gone. No goodbyes, no forwarding address. Only a hairbrush left behind with a few strands of auburn hair the same color as Karen's caught in the bristles. 3 months later, they received word that Sarah had died of fever in Santa Fe. Karen never learned if it was true or merely a convenient fiction to explain her mother's permanent absence. Henry's drinking, already bad, grew worse. Karen learned to cook clean and eventually to dodge his wild swings when the liquor made him mean. She taught herself to read from her mother's abandoned books, and later a kind schoolteacher recognized her intelligence and allowed her to sit in on lessons. By 16, Karen was teaching the younger children their letters while their parents worked. By 18, she was the unofficial schoolmistress of Dry Creek, holding classes in the back room of the general store. Then came the night Henry Dalton, in a drunken rage, had broken into Jenkins's apothecary, smashed the window and shelves of medicines, and somehow managed to contaminate the town well with kerosene. No one was injured, but the damage was extensive. The town council, led by Mayor Whitmore, had demanded payment far more than the actual damages Karen suspected. When she couldn't produce the money, they stripped her of her teaching position. "Can't have someone of questionable moral character instructing our children," Whitmore had said, though his eyes lingered on her in a way that suggested moral character wasn't his true concern. Since then, Karen had taken in mending cleaned houses and done whatever work she could find. It was never enough to pay down the debt, and certainly not enough to escape Dry Creek. Today's public shaming had been Whitmore's latest attempt to break her spirit. And it might have worked, if not for the unexpected intervention of Daniel Mercer, a man whose mere name could silence a crowded saloon. A sharp knock at the cabin door jolted Karen from her thoughts. She rose quietly, careful not to wake her father. The moon provided just enough light to navigate the cluttered floor. When she opened the door, Sheriff James Wade stood on the threshold, his young face grave in the moonlight. "Miss Dalton," he said, removing his hat, "I need to speak with you." Karen stepped outside, pulling the door closed behind her. "If you've come to take me back to that post—" "No," Wade interrupted, voice low. "I've come to warn you. What Mercer did today, it stirred things up. Mayor Whitmore isn't pleased. The mayor is rarely pleased with anything concerning me." Wade glanced nervously toward the dark road. "You don't understand. Mercer was my mentor once before he resigned his judgeship. I trained under him when I first joined the territorial marshals." This surprised Karen. "You never mentioned knowing him." "It's not something Whitmore would appreciate." Wade stepped closer. "Listen to me. Mercer doesn't involve himself in town matters without reason. If he's taken an interest in your situation, there's more happening than appears. He gave me bread sheriff. I wouldn't call that taking an interest." Wade shook his head. "You don't know him like I do. Every action has purpose with Daniel Mercer." He hesitated, then added, "Whitmore wants your land, Miss Dalton. There's silver in these hills. The railroad's coming through next year, and your father's remaining acres sit right where Whitmore needs the depot to be." Karen's breath caught. Is that what this has all been about? The debt, the public shaming? "Just watch yourself," Wade said, settling his hat back on his head. "And maybe consider what Mercer's offering." "He's offering nothing." Wade gave her a long look. "We'll see." He turned to leave, then paused. "One more thing. Don't tell anyone I was here tonight." As the sheriff disappeared into the darkness, Karen remained on the porch, arms wrapped around herself against the night chill. In the distance, a coyote howled, a lonely, haunting sound that seemed to echo her own isolation. Inside the cabin, Henry Dalton wasn't as unconscious as he appeared. He'd heard every word through the thin door. Now, as Karen returned inside, he kept his eyes closed, his breathing deliberately heavy. When he was certain his daughter had settled back onto her pallet, Henry allowed himself a thin smile in the darkness. So Whitmore wanted their land for silver, and the railroad, did he? That explained a lot. Henry's clouded mind turned over this new information, connecting it to secrets he'd long kept buried. Whitmore's rise to power in Dry Creek hadn't been as clean as people believed. There had been another man once, Whitmore's business partner in the early days, who had mysteriously disappeared after discovering a silver vein on his property. Property that now belonged to Mayor Whitmore. Henry had witnessed something the night that man vanished, something he'd been too cowardly and too fond of the hush money that kept him in whiskey to ever speak of. But perhaps it was time to use that knowledge. If not to save himself, then maybe to secure a future for Karen. Outside the cabin's single window, a shadow moved silently away from the glass. The eavesdropper had heard enough. Daniel Mercer sat before his fireplace, cleaning his revolver, with the methodical precision of a man who has performed the same ritual for decades. The cabin was silent, save for the crackling of the fire and the soft sound of the cleaning cloth against metal. The interior of his home reflected the man austere but dignified. Bookshelves lined one wall filled with law texts and history volumes. A desk in the corner held neatly stacked papers and correspondence. The only personal touch was the daguerreotype of Lisbeth on the mantel, and beside it, a smaller photograph of a young man in a Union uniform. Daniel reassembled the Colt with practiced hands, his thoughts on the day's events. He hadn't planned to intervene on Karen Dalton's behalf. He'd ridden into town for supplies, nothing more. But the sight of her bound to that post back straight, despite her circumstances, had stopped him cold. She had Lisbeth's eyes. Not in color, his wife's had been dark brown while Karen's were green, but in spirit. The same unflinching dignity in the face of cruelty. A soft knock at the door broke his reverie. Daniel rose, gun in hand, and crossed to the entrance. Few visited his ranch, and none after dark. "Who's there?" he called, voice sharp. "Miguel Rodriguez, senor. I bring news." Daniel opened the door to his ranch hand, who entered with the nervous energy of a man carrying unwelcome information. "Sheriff Wade visited the Dalton girl tonight," Miguel said without preamble. "He warned her about Whitmore's plans for her land." Daniel's expression didn't change, but his eyes narrowed slightly. "You were watching the Dalton place. My sister Elena asked me to. The women in town are concerned for Karen." "Since when does your sister concern herself with a white girl's troubles?" Miguel shrugged. "Since that white girl taught our children to read when no one else would. Since she tended wounds after the Rangers came through last spring." He paused. "And since she never once looked at us like we were less than human." Daniel absorbed this information silently, returning his gun to its holster. "What else? Whitmore has hired new men. Jackson and his gang from El Paso." Miguel's expression darkened. "They are not cowboys or ranch hands, senor. They are killers." The name was familiar. William Jackson had earned a reputation during the war as a border raider who used the conflict as cover for robbery and murder. After the war, he'd become a gun for hire, selling his services to whoever paid best. "When did they arrive?" "Yesterday. 5 men heavily armed." Miguel hesitated. "There is something else. The old man, Henry Dalton, he was awake when Wade spoke to his daughter. He knows something about Whitmore, something from the past." Daniel moved to the window, looking out at the darkness. "Whitmore's kept his position through fear and manipulation. If Dalton has leverage, he is a dead man," Miguel finished bluntly. Daniel turned, decision made. "Ride back to town. Tell Elena to keep watch on the Dalton place. I'll come at dawn." After Miguel left, Daniel returned to the fireplace. He knelt and pried up a loose floorboard, revealing a dusty strongbox. From it, he removed a folded document bearing the territorial seal and a silver star, the badge of a federal judge that he'd put away 5 years ago when he buried his wife. "Looks like I'm breaking my promise, Lisbeth," he murmured to the daguerreotype. "Getting involved again." The woman in the picture seemed to stare back with fierce approval. Karen woke to the sound of her father's racking cough. The gray light of dawn filtered through the cabin's single window as she hurried to his side. Henry sat on the edge of his cot, doubled-over handkerchief pressed to his mouth. When he pulled it away, Karen saw the bright spots of blood. "It's nothing," he wheezed, seeing her concern. "Just too much dust in this damn place." Karen fetched water, helping him drink slowly. His hands trembled violently, whether from illness or the need for morning whiskey, she couldn't tell. "Listen to me, girl," Henry said, gripping her wrist with surprising strength. "I need to tell you something. About Whitmore." Karen frowned. "What about him?" "He's not what people think. Before he was mayor back in '58, he had a partner, James Ellsworth. They found silver together, but Whitmore wanted it all." Henry's bloodshot eyes darted to the window. "I saw him, Karen. Saw him shoot Ellsworth in the back out by Cottonwood Creek." Karen stared at her father, trying to determine if this was drunken rambling or truth. "Why have you never said anything?" Henry laughed bitterly, triggering another coughing fit. "Because he paid me to keep quiet. Paid me in whiskey and cash for years." He grabbed her hands. "But I kept evidence. Insurance. It's under the floorboard in the corner wrapped in oilcloth. A letter Ellsworth wrote claiming he'd found silver and feared Whitmore might try something. And the bullet I dug out of the creek bank where it happened." "Father, if this is true—" "It's true," Henry insisted. "And it's why I want you to go to Mercer. Today. Tell him everything. He was a judge. He'll know what to do." Karen pulled back. "Why would you trust him? You've always said he was a Yankee butcher." Henry's face softened, revealing glimpses of the man he'd been before whiskey, and bitterness consumed him. "Because he did what I never could. He stood up when it mattered." His voice dropped. "Your mother would have liked him." A sharp knock at the door cut their conversation short. Karen rose warily, but before she could reach the door, it burst open. Mayor Whitmore stood on the threshold, flanked by two men Karen didn't recognize, hard-faced strangers with guns holstered prominently on their hips. "Good morning, Miss Dalton," Whitmore said with cold courtesy. "I believe we have business to discuss." Behind him, at the edge of their small yard, Karen could see Pastor Collins watching from horseback, his expression troubled. And beyond, hidden in the shadows between buildings, the unmistakable figure of Daniel Mercer, utterly still as he observed the unfolding scene. An end of Part 1 continues in Part 2. I've written the first part of Justice on the Frontier, a cinematic Western tale focused on themes of justice, dignity, and redemption. This opening section establishes our main characters and the central conflict. 1. Karen Dalton. A proud, resilient young woman bearing the burden of her father's debts and reputation in a judgmental frontier town. 2. Daniel Mercer. A former federal judge who now lives in isolation, haunted by his past and his wife's death, who unexpectedly intervenes when he sees Karen publicly humiliated. 3. Mayor Whitmore, the antagonist who uses his power to manipulate the town with secret motives involving silver on the Dalton property. The story opens with a powerful hook. Karen tied to the town post for public humiliation, establishing the harsh frontier justice of 1873 New Mexico territory. We learn about the complex dynamics of the post-Civil War town and the deep-seated tensions between various factions. I've included several mini cliffhangers throughout, and ended with the major cliffhanger of Whitmore arriving with gunmen at Karen's home just as her father reveals damning evidence against the mayor, while Daniel Mercer watches from the shadows. Would you like me to continue with Part 2, or do you have any feedback on Part 1 before I proceed? Retry DN, okay, next Part 2, Edit on Justice on the Frontier. Mayor Whitmore stepped into the Dalton cabin with the confidence of a man already certain of his victory. His two companions remained at the threshold, hands resting casually on their gun belts. "I trust you're recovered from yesterday's unpleasantness," Whitmore said to Karen, his voice carrying the practiced concern of a politician. His eyes, however, remained cold as he surveyed the shabby interior. Henry struggled to his feet, swaying slightly. "State your business and get out, Whitmore." The mayor's smile didn't reach his eyes. "My business is with your daughter Dalton, though I'm pleased to find you conscious for once." He turned to Karen. "Miss Dalton, in light of your family's continued inability to meet its obligations to this town, the council has made a decision." He withdrew an official-looking document from his coat. "This notice gives you precisely 2 weeks to settle your debt in full, or the property will be seized as payment." Karen took the paper with steady hands. "The debt has nearly doubled since your last accounting. Interest accrues, Miss Dalton. Perhaps, if you'd been more diligent in your payments—" Henry lurched forward. "You thieving bastard! You've been inflating that debt for years." One of Whitmore's men stepped inside, hand moving to his gun. Karen recognized him now, William Jackson, a notorious gun for hire whose exploits were whispered about even in Dry Creek. "Watch your tone, old man," Jackson drawled, his Texas accent thick with menace. Whitmore raised a hand. "That's enough, Mr. Jackson." He adjusted his coat sleeves. 2 weeks, Miss Dalton. After that, you'll need to find other accommodations." His gaze lingered on her. "Unless, of course, we could come to some alternative arrangement." The implication hung in the air, unmistakable and vile. "Get out," Karen said, her voice quiet but firm. Whitmore shrugged. "As you wish, but do consider your options carefully. Judge Mercer's interference yesterday was irregular. I wouldn't count on such charity continuing." As they turned to leave, Whitmore paused. "Oh, and Henry," he glanced back at Karen's father. "I'd be careful with those wild stories of yours. Slander is a serious offense in this territory." The threat landed with precision. Henry paled, confirming to Karen that his accusations against Whitmore weren't mere drunken fabrications. After they departed, Karen moved to the window. Pastor Collins still sat on horseback, watching the cabin with an unreadable expression. Of Daniel Mercer, there was no sign. "You need to find that evidence," Henry whispered urgently. "Now, before they come back." Karen knelt in the corner, prying up the loose floorboard her father had indicated. Inside the small cavity lay an oilskin package yellowed with age. She unwrapped it carefully to reveal a folded letter, the paper brittle and discolored, and a small lead bullet misshapen from impact. She scanned the letter quickly. It was dated April 12, 1858, and signed by James Ellsworth. The contents were damning. Ellsworth had discovered a significant silver deposit on their joint claim, but feared Whitmore might try to claim it entirely. He'd written the letter as insurance to be found if anything happened to him. "This is why Whitmore wants our land," Karen realized. "The silver vein must extend onto our property." Henry nodded weakly, another coughing fit overtaking him. "Hide it somewhere safe," he managed between spasms. "Not here." Karen rewrapped the evidence and tucked it into her bodice. "I need to get you to Dr. Tunner." "Dr. Montgomery." "No time," Henry wheezed. "Go to Mercer. Today." Before Karen could respond, a soft knock came at the back door. She froze, fearing Whitmore had returned. Instead, when she cautiously opened it, she found Elena Rodriguez standing there, her dark eyes watchful. "Miss Karen," Elena said softly, "you must come quickly. My brother Miguel is waiting with horses behind the livery." "I can't leave my father." "I will stay with him," Elena insisted, stepping inside. Judge Mercer sent us. It is not safe for you here. Karen hesitated, torn between her duty to her ailing father and the clear danger Whitmore presented. Go, Henry urged, his voice barely audible. Find Mercer. Show him the proof. With reluctance, Karen gathered a few essentials in a small bundle. She kissed her father's forehead, shocked at the heat of his skin. I'll send the doctor, she promised. Don't worry about me, Henry replied with a weak smile. Time I paid for my own sins. Karen slipped out the back door, following the path Elena had indicated. The sun had barely cleared the eastern hills, casting long shadows that provided some cover as she made her way toward the livery stable. Miguel waited as promised with 2 horses. Quickly, he urged, helping her mount. Whitmore's men are watching the main roads. They rode hard, taking a circuitous route through arroyos and dry creek beds where their tracks would be difficult to follow. Karen clutched her bundle, acutely aware of the evidence concealed against her skin. After an hour's ride, they crested a ridge overlooking Daniel Mercer's ranch. The main house stood solid and weathered among cottonwood trees, with a barn and corral nearby. Unlike many properties in the territory, it was well maintained, the fence posts straight, the roof intact. Miguel led her down the slope toward the ranch. Judge Mercer is waiting for you. As they approached, Daniel emerged from the barn, wiping his hands on a cloth. He watched their arrival with the same steady gaze Karen remembered from the market square. Miss Dalton, he said simply, taking the reins of her horse as she dismounted. Judge Mercer, she replied, legs unsteady after the hard ride. I'm not a judge anymore. And yet you still dispense justice. Something like amusement flickered in his eyes, quickly suppressed. Come inside. You look ready to collapse. The interior of Mercer's home surprised Karen. She'd expected Spartan quarters, but while the furnishings were simple, the walls held bookshelves filled with volumes on law, history, and literature. A desk in the corner suggested a man who still conducted business of some kind. The place was meticulously clean. Daniel gestured to a chair at the kitchen table. Sit. You need water and food. He moved with efficiency, placing bread, cheese, and dried apple slices before her, along with a cup of cool water. Karen realized how hungry she was. She hadn't eaten since the previous day. Thank you, she said, for the bread yesterday, and for sending Miguel and Elena. Daniel nodded once, sitting across from her. Whitmore visited you this morning. It wasn't a question, but Karen answered anyway. He's given us 2 weeks to pay our debt or lose the land. And your father told you about James Ellsworth. Karen stared at him. How could you know that? Miguel was watching your cabin. He couldn't hear what was said, but he read Whitmore's threat in his posture. Daniel's expression remained neutral. Your father knows something dangerous. Karen hesitated, then reached into her bodice and withdrew the oilskin package. She placed it on the table between them. My father witnessed Whitmore murder his business partner 15 years ago. He kept evidence as insurance. Daniel unwrapped the package carefully, reading the letter and examining the bullet without comment. When he finally looked up, his eyes had hardened. This would be enough to warrant an investigation at minimum. Is that what you'll do? Investigate Whitmore? Daniel rewrapped the evidence. The territorial courts are corrupt. Whitmore has friends in Santa Fe. He stood, returning the package to her. Keep this hidden. I need to consider our next steps. Our next steps, Karen echoed, confused by his inclusion of himself in her troubles. Daniel paused by the window, looking out toward Dry Creek. Whitmore threatens not just you, Miss Dalton. His influence has poisoned the entire region. He turned back to her. You can stay here. There's a room my housekeeper used before she returned to her family in Mexico. It's small, but private. I I need to check on my father, Karen said, rising. He's very ill. Miguel will return to town and bring word of his condition. Daniel's tone softened slightly. For now, you need rest. As if sensing her continued reluctance, he added, Your father asked you to bring me the evidence. You've done that. Now, let me determine how best to use it. Karen knew he was right, though it pained her to be away from her father when he was so unwell. She nodded slowly. Thank you, she said again, the words feeling inadequate. Daniel merely inclined his head and left her to her meal. Sheriff James Wade found Henry Dalton's condition worsening when he arrived that afternoon. Elena Rodriguez sat by the old man's bedside, pressing cool cloths to his forehead. "Where's Karen?" Wade asked, removing his hat. "Safe," Elena replied simply. Wade nodded, relieved. "Dr. Montgomery is coming. I told him it was urgent." Henry's eyes fluttered open. "Sheriff?" he croaked. "Need to tell you something." Wade leaned closer. "Save your strength, Mr. Dalton. No time." Henry clutched at Wade's sleeve. "Whitmore killed Ellsworth. I saw it. Told Karen. Evidence." Wade's expression grew grim. "I'll handle it, sir. You rest now." As he straightened, a shadow darkened the doorway. Pastor Collins stood there, Bible in hand, his tall frame silhouetted against the afternoon light. "Sheriff," Collins acknowledged, "I've come to pray with Henry." Wade nodded curtly. "He needs a doctor more than prayers, Pastor." "He shall have both," Collins replied, moving to Henry's bedside. He glanced at Elena. "You may go, woman. I'll sit with him now." Elena hesitated, looking to Wade for guidance. "It's all right," the sheriff assured her. "I'll stay until the doctor arrives." After Elena departed, Collins opened his Bible but didn't immediately begin reading. Instead, he studied Henry's face with an uncharacteristic intensity. "Has he been speaking coherently, Sheriff?" Wade's hand instinctively moved closer to his gun. "Comes and goes. Fever talk, mostly." Collins nodded slowly. "Of course. The ravings of a dying drunkard wouldn't hold much weight, would they? I wouldn't know about that." The pastor's eyes narrowed slightly. "Where is the daughter? Miss Dalton, I haven't seen her today. Strange that she would leave her father in such a state." Wade shrugged. "Maybe she went for medicine." Their conversation was interrupted by Dr. Montgomery's arrival. The physician, a harried man in his 60s, shooed them both away from the bed to examine his patient. Wade took the opportunity to step outside, Collins following. "Whitmore is concerned about certain rumors Henry may be spreading," Collins said once they were alone. "Delusions, of course, but potentially damaging." "I'm not in the rumor business, Pastor," Wade replied evenly. Collins smiled thinly. "We're all in the rumor business in a town this size, Sheriff. I merely suggest that as a man of the law, you consider the source of any accusations you might hear." Wade met the pastor's gaze directly. "I consider evidence, not rumors. Good day, Pastor." As he walked away, Wade could feel Collins watching him. The sheriff's hand remained near his gun until he turned the corner. Karen woke from a deep sleep, momentarily disoriented by unfamiliar surroundings. The small room Daniel had offered was sparsely furnished, but clean, with a narrow bed, a washstand, and a window overlooking the ranch yard. The quality of the light suggested late afternoon. She'd slept far longer than intended, exhausted by the events of the past 2 days. Rising, she splashed water on her face from the basin and smoothed her rumpled dress as best she could. The oilskin package remained secure in her bodice, the weight of it a constant reminder of the danger she faced. When she emerged from the room, she found the main part of the house empty. Through the window, she spotted Daniel in the corral working with a spirited bay horse. His movements were patient and deliberate as he guided the animal through its paces. Karen stepped outside, shielding her eyes against the late sun. The air smelled of sage and pine cleaner than the dust and smoke of Dry Creek. Daniel acknowledged her presence with a nod, but continued his work. Karen leaned against the corral fence, watching in silence. Finally, Daniel released the horse to run freely around the enclosure and approached her. "You slept," he observed. "I needed it," she admitted. "Any word from town?" "Not yet. Miguel will return by sundown." Karen nodded, then asked the question that had been troubling her since yesterday. "Why did you help me at the market post?" Daniel's expression remained impassive, but something flickered in his eyes. "It wasn't justice. There are many injustices in Dry Creek. You don't intervene in all of them." He was silent for a long moment, his gaze shifting to the distant mountains. "You reminded me of someone." Before Karen could inquire further, the sound of approaching horses drew their attention. Miguel rode into the yard accompanied by Sheriff Wade. Daniel's posture changed subtly, one hand moving closer to the revolver at his hip. "Stay here," he instructed Karen, moving to meet the riders. Wade dismounted first, raising his hand slightly to show he came peacefully. "Judge Mercer," he called, "I need to speak with you and Miss Dalton." Daniel's expression remained wary. "Speak about what Sheriff Henry Dalton is dead." Karen felt the world tilt beneath her. She gripped the fence for support, a small sound of distress escaping her lips. Wade turned toward her, regret evident in his young face. "I'm sorry, Miss Dalton. Dr. Montgomery did everything he could, but the pneumonia was too advanced." "When?" she managed to ask. 2 hours ago. Pastor Collins was with him at the end." Daniel moved to Karen's side, his solid presence grounding her as grief threatened to overwhelm her senses. "There's more," Wade continued grimly. "Mayor Whitmore is claiming the Dalton property, immediately citing unpaid debts and the absence of legal heirs." "I am the legal heir," Karen protested. Wade shook his head. "He's produced a document showing your father sold him the remaining property last month." "That's impossible. My father would never—" "The document bears his signature," Wade interrupted, "or what appears to be his signature. It's been witnessed by Pastor Collins and 2 others. Daniel's eyes narrowed. "A forgery." "Almost certainly," Wade agreed. "But it will hold up unless challenged in court." Karen felt cold rage replacing her initial shock. "They waited until he died to produce this document. Convenient timing." "Too convenient," Daniel agreed. He studied Wade intently. "Why are you telling us this, Sheriff? You're risking your position." Wade's jaw tightened. "Because what they're doing isn't right. And because Henry Dalton told me Whitmore killed James Ellsworth 15 years ago." "You believe him?" "I believe it warrants investigation, but Whitmore's blocking any official inquiry." Wade glanced at Karen. "I can't help openly without losing my badge. But I thought you should know what you're facing." Daniel nodded once. "We appreciate the warning." As Wade prepared to depart, he added, "There's a rumor Whitmore's men are searching for Karen. Be careful." After the sheriff rode away, Karen remained motionless, trying to process her father's death and Whitmore's latest manipulation. "I need to bury him," she said finally, her voice hollow. Daniel nodded. "We'll go tomorrow. It's too dangerous tonight." Karen turned to him, eyes bright with unshed tears and determination. "Judge Mercer." "Daniel," he corrected gently. "Daniel," she amended. "I want justice for my father, and I want my land back." His expression softened slightly. "We'll get both, Miss Dalton." "Karen," she said. "If I'm to call you Daniel, then I'm Karen to you." Something unspoken passed between them in that moment, not quite trust, but the foundation of it. An alliance forged in shared purpose. The moment was broken by Miguel clearing his throat. "Judge, there is something else. The roof of Miss Karen's cabin, someone has repaired it." Karen frowned. "What? When?" "Last night, it seems. Elena said men came after dark. They fixed the roof, repaired the well pump, left food in the storage box." Daniel's expression darkened. "Whitmore's men." Miguel shook his head. "No, these were ordinary men from town. The blacksmith Jenkins, from the apothecary others." Karen stared at him in disbelief. "Why would they help me?" Elena said they spoke of shame, for what happened at the market post. Miguel's expression softened. It seems Judge Mercer's actions made an impression. Daniel turned away, uncomfortable with this revelation. "Prepare supper," he instructed Miguel. "We've plans to make for tomorrow." As Miguel departed, Karen studied Daniel's profile against the setting sun. "One loaf of bread," she murmured. "One simple act of decency, and it spreads." Daniel didn't respond, but something in his posture suggested her words had reached him. In Dry Creek, Mayor Whitmore paced his office, fury evident in every line of his body. Pastor Collins sat nearby, watching with growing unease. "She's with Mercer," Whitmore spat. "Jackson's men confirmed it." Collins nodded. "It's concerning, certainly, but—" "Concerning," Whitmore rounded on him. "It's a disaster if Henry told her about Ellsworth, and she shared that with Mercer." He slammed his fist on the desk. "That self-righteous bastard won't let it go." "Henry Dalton was a known drunk," Collins reasoned. "His word against yours would hold little weight." "It's not his word I'm worried about. It's evidence." Whitmore resumed pacing. "We need to find what he kept. Search the cabin again." Collins hesitated. "There may be complications. Sheriff Wade seems uncommitted to our cause lately." "Wade is a coward playing at bravery. He'll fall in line." "And if he doesn't," Whitmore's expression turned calculating, "then Jackson will help him reconsider his position." He poured himself a glass of whiskey. "What of the townsfolk? Any further dissent after Mercer's little display?" Collins shifted uncomfortably. "Some questionable charity toward the Dalton girl. Minor repairs to her property." "Who?" "Jenkins, Morton, a few others. Nothing significant." Whitmore's eyes narrowed. "Make it clear during Sunday's sermon that Christian charity is wasted on those who reject the town's moral guidance." "Of course," Collins agreed, though his voice lacked conviction. Whitmore noticed. "Having doubts, Pastor, not doubts exactly, but the girl herself has done nothing wrong." "She's defied my authority," Whitmore cut in. "She's aligned herself with Mercer, and now she might possess evidence that could destroy everything we've built." He leaned closer. "Remember, Collins, your position in this town depends entirely on my goodwill." The threat hung between them, clear and unmistakable. Collins nodded slowly. "I understand." "Good." Whitmore drained his glass. "Now we need to prepare for tomorrow. If she comes for her father's burial, we'll be waiting." Dawn broke over the New Mexico landscape in streaks of crimson and gold, painting the mesas and arroyos with light that seemed to ignite the very dust. Karen sat on Daniel's porch, a cup of coffee warming her hands against the morning chill. She'd slept little, her mind consumed with grief and determination in equal measure. Daniel emerged from the barn, leading 2 saddled horses. He'd spoken few words since they'd risen, respecting her need for silence as she prepared to bury her father. We should leave soon, he said, checking the cinch on his saddle. It's a 2-hour ride if we take the back trails. Karen nodded, finishing her coffee. She wore a simple black dress that Elena had brought from town, one of her own altered hastily to fit Karen's slighter frame. The oilskin package remained concealed in an inner pocket. Miguel approached with a small bundle. Food for the journey, he explained, handing it to Daniel. And Elena sent this for Miss Karen. He passed her a small wooden cross, roughly but carefully carved. For the grave, he added softly. Karen's throat tightened with unexpected emotion. Thank her for me, she managed. Daniel helped her mount his hands strong and steady at her waist. They rode out as the sun cleared the eastern hills, taking a circuitous route through ravines and dry stream beds to avoid the main trails where Whitmore's men might be watching. They spoke little during the journey, but the silence between them was companionable rather than strained. Occasionally, Daniel would point out landmarks or signs of wildlife. A hawk circling overhead, deer tracks crossing their path, a coyote slipping away through the brush. As they neared Dry Creek, Daniel grew more vigilant, scanning the landscape constantly for signs of danger. They approached the town from the north, avoiding the main streets, by circling through a stand of cottonwoods that bordered the small cemetery. Dr. Montgomery waited for them there, standing beside a fresh grave at the cemetery's edge. To Karen's surprise, Sheriff Wade was also present, along with Elena Rodriguez and several other Mexican women from the community. I didn't expect anyone to come, Karen said softly as they dismounted. Your father wasn't all bad, Dr. Montgomery replied. Before the drink took hold of him, he was a skilled carpenter, built half the cabins in town. He glanced at the simple pine coffin waiting beside the grave. I thought he deserved better than a pauper's burial. Karen was touched by the unexpected kindness. Thank you, Doctor. The funeral was brief but dignified. Pastor Collins was notably absent, but Dr. Montgomery read a few verses from his own Bible. Karen placed wildflowers on the coffin desert blooms Daniel had helped her gather during their journey. As the men began to lower the coffin, movement at the cemetery gate caught Karen's attention. William Jackson stood watching, flanked by 2 of his men. Their presence was clearly meant as intimidation, rather than respect for the dead. Daniel noticed them too, his hand moving instinctively to his gun. Wade stepped forward, positioning himself between the gunman and the mourners. This is a funeral, Jackson, the sheriff said firmly. Show some respect. Jackson smirked. Just paying my respects, Sheriff. Mayor Whitmore was concerned about Miss Dalton's well-being. She's well enough, Wade replied. You can report that back to him. Jackson's gaze shifted to Karen, then to Daniel. Judge Mercer, he drawled. Heard you were riding with the lady these days. Quite a step down from hanging men for the Union. Daniel's expression remained impassive, but his eyes hardened. Careful, Jackson. Your reputation precedes you, but it won't protect you. The gunman's hand twitched near his holster. For a moment, violence seemed imminent. Then Elena stepped forward, her dark eyes flashing with anger. This is sacred ground, she said firmly. You dishonor the dead with your presence. To everyone's surprise, Jackson backed down, touching the brim of his hat. Another time, then, he said, before turning away with his men. The burial concluded without further interruption. As the last shovelful of earth was placed on the grave, Karen set the wooden cross at its head. She stood silently, saying a private farewell to the complicated man who had been her father. Afterward, Dr. Montgomery approached Daniel. A word, Judge, he said quietly, drawing him aside. Karen couldn't hear their conversation, but she noted the gravity in both men's expressions. When Daniel returned to her side, his jaw was set in a hard line. What is it? She asked. Later, he replied, helping her mount. "We should leave before Jackson returns with reinforcements." They rode toward the Dalton cabin, accompanied by Sheriff Wade. Karen was anxious to see the property one last time and to retrieve any personal items before Whitmore claimed it completely. As they approached, Karen gasped. The cabin's appearance had changed dramatically since her departure. The roof was entirely repaired, the sagging porch straightened, the well pump replaced with a newer model. Someone had even planted flowers along the path to the door. "Who did this?" she asked in wonder. Wade smiled slightly. "Started with Jenkins from the apothecary. Said he felt ashamed after seeing you at the post. Others joined in, Morton the blacksmith, Widow Parker, even some of the ranchers' wives. They brought food, too." Karen dismounted, slowly, touched beyond words. She'd lived in Dry Creek her entire life, often feeling isolated and judged. The idea that her neighbors had rallied to her aid was almost impossible to comprehend. Inside the cabin had been cleaned thoroughly. Fresh linens covered the bed, and the cupboard contained provisions, flour, coffee, sugar, dried meat, and fruit. On the table sat a loaf of fresh bread wrapped in clean cloth. Karen lifted it, remembering Daniel's similar gesture at the market post. "Bread," she murmured. "Such a simple thing, and yet—" Daniel stood in the doorway, watching her with an unreadable expression. "It means community," he said quietly. "Breaking bread together, sharing sustenance." Sheriff Wade cleared his throat. "You should know Whitmore's been to the territorial office. He's filed his claim on this property using that forged bill of sale. It'll be official by week's end unless challenged." Karen set the bread down. "We'll challenge it. My father left evidence of Whitmore's crimes." "It won't be simple," Wade cautioned. "Whitmore has influence with the territorial judge. Then we'll find another way," Daniel interjected. He turned to Karen. "Gather what you need. We shouldn't linger." As Karen collected her few precious possessions, her mother's hairbrush, a small book of poetry, a quilt she'd made herself, Wade drew Daniel outside. "What did Montgomery tell you?" the sheriff asked in a low voice. Daniel's expression darkened. He examined Henry's body before burial. Found bruising on the neck, hidden by the shirt collar. The pneumonia was real, but someone helped Henry along to his grave. Wade cursed softly. "Whitmore. Or one of his men. Either way, we're dealing with murder now, not just fraud." Their conversation was interrupted by the sound of approaching horses. Daniel's hand moved to his gun, but Wade shook his head. "It's all right," he said. "I recognize those riders." 3 men approached on horseback. Jenkins, the apothecary, Morton, the blacksmith, and Harlan Reed, a rancher whose property bordered the Dalton land. They dismounted cautiously, nodding to Wade and eyeing Daniel with a mixture of respect and wariness. Jenkins stepped forward, hat in hand. "Miss Dalton, we wanted to pay our respects." Wade gestured toward the cabin. "She's gathering her things. Heard Whitmore's claiming the property," Morton said, his massive blacksmith's arms crossed over his chest, "using some paper Henry supposedly signed." "It's a forgery," Daniel confirmed. Reed spat into the dust. "Figured as much. Whitmore's been trying to get his hands on this land for years. Says the railroad needs it for the depot, but we all know it's the silver he's after." Daniel's eyebrows rose slightly. "You know about the silver." "Folks ain't stupid, Judge," Morton replied. "Whitmore brings in mining engineers, thinks no one notices. We've known something valuable was here since he killed Ellsworth 15 years back." Wade stared at him. "You knew about Ellsworth's murder." The 3 men exchanged glances. "Suspected," Jenkins clarified. "Nothing we could prove, but Ellsworth was talking about a big strike one day and gone the next. Whitmore said he'd moved on, but his gear was still in his room. Nobody leaves without their gear. Daniel studied them thoughtfully. Why come forward now? Reed removed his hat, running a hand through graying hair. What happened to Miss Dalton at that post? It wasn't right. My Eliza was sick 3 winters back. Town doctor was away. Miss Dalton came out to our place, sat with Eliza 3 days straight. Never asked for payment. Jenkins nodded. She taught my grandson to read when the schoolmistress said he was too slow-witted. Boy's working in my shop now, keeping all my accounts. Karen emerged from the cabin in time to hear these testimonials, her few possessions bundled in a shawl. She stood, silent emotion evident in her eyes. We can't stand openly against Whitmore, Morton admitted. Man controls too much in this town. But we wanted you to know you got friends here, Miss Dalton. Karen stepped forward. I never knew, she said softly. Folks don't always speak up when they should, Reed acknowledged with regret. But Judge Mercer here reminded us what courage looks like. Daniel shifted uncomfortably at this praise. Your support is welcome, he said, but it puts you at risk. Whitmore won't take opposition lightly. We know the risk, Jenkins replied firmly. But sometimes a man has to decide what kind of town he wants to live in. Their conversation was interrupted by Elena Rodriguez, who came running from the direction of town, her dark hair falling loose from its pins. Riders coming, she called breathlessly. Jackson and his men with torches. Daniel immediately took charge. Wade, get Karen out of here. Take the North Trail back to my ranch. He turned to the 3 townsmen. If you stand with us, now's the time to prove it. Reed nodded grimly. What's your plan, Judge? We delay them. Give Karen time to escape with the evidence. Daniel checked his revolver. But no killing unless absolutely necessary. We want justice, not vengeance. Karen protested. I won't leave you to face them alone. Daniel's expression softened slightly as he looked at her. This isn't your battle alone anymore. Go with Wade. Keep the evidence safe. Before she could argue further, the first riders appeared on the road from town Jackson, and 4 men torches, burning, despite the daylight, their intentions clear. Go, Daniel urged, and Wade pulled Karen toward the waiting horses. As they mounted, Karen looked back one last time. Daniel stood with Jenkins, Morton, and Reed, 4 men prepared to make a stand against Whitmore's enforcers. Wade led her away at a gallop, taking a trail that wound through thick brush, where they would be difficult to follow. Behind them, Karen heard shouting, then a single gunshot that echoed across the valley. Her heart pounded with fear for Daniel and the others, but she pressed on, the precious evidence secure against her body. Whatever happened now, she would ensure Whitmore faced justice for her father, for James Ellsworth, and for all those who had suffered under his corrupt rule. Daniel stood his ground as Jackson and his men reined in before the cabin. The gunmen's expressions registered surprise at finding opposition waiting for them. Afternoon, Jackson, Daniel called calmly. Seems you're a bit overdressed for a social call. Jackson's eyes narrowed as he took in the 4 men blocking his path. Step aside, Mercer. Our business is with the Dalton girl. Miss Dalton isn't available, Daniel replied, and this property is still legally hers pending court review of Whitmore's suspicious claim. One of Jackson's men spat into the dust. Ain't nothing suspicious about it. Old man Dalton signed it over fair and square. Then you won't mind waiting for the territorial judge to confirm that. Reed interjected, his rancher's hand resting near his own sidearm. Jackson smiled unpleasantly. Mayor's orders are to secure the property. Anyone interfering is trespassing. He nodded to his men. Burn it down. Whitmore says if he can't have it, nobody will, Buddy. That's not happening, Daniel said quietly, his hand now resting openly on his gun. For a tense moment, no one moved. Then Jackson's hand darted toward his holster. Daniel drew with the swift precision of a man who had spent years enforcing frontier justice. His shot caught Jackson's shoulder, spinning the gunman halfway around before he tumbled from his horse. "Next one won't be so merciful," Daniel announced, his revolver now trained on the remaining riders. "Drop your weapons." Two of the men immediately complied, raising their hands. The third hesitated, then reached slowly for his gun. Morton's shotgun boomed the blast, kicking up dirt at the horse's feet. The animal reared in panic, throwing its rider to the ground. "That's enough," Daniel commanded as Jenkins and Reed quickly collected the dropped weapons. "Take Jackson and go. Tell Whitmore if he wants this property, he'll need to prove his claim legally." Here Jackson struggled to his feet, clutching his bleeding shoulder. "This ain't over, Mercer," he snarled. "Not by a long shot." "It's Judge Mercer to you," Daniel corrected him coldly. "And I'm still capable of passing sentence when required." The gunmen retreated, helping their wounded leader onto his horse. As they rode away, Daniel turned to his unlikely allies. "You've made enemies today," he warned them. "Whitmore won't forget this defiance." Reed shrugged. "Some things are worth standing for, Judge. Miss Dalton is one of them." Daniel nodded, a new respect in his eyes. "Guard the property in shifts. I don't think they'll return immediately, but be vigilant." "What about you?" Jenkins asked. "I'm going after Karen and Wade. Once I know they're safe, I'll return." Daniel mounted his horse. "And gentlemen, thank you." As he rode away, Daniel reflected on the unexpected turn of events. He'd isolated himself for 5 years, avoiding entanglement in others' problems. Now he found himself at the center of a brewing conflict with allies he hadn't sought and responsibilities he hadn't planned to shoulder. He thought of Karen Dalton's quiet dignity at the market post, of the evidence she carried against Whitmore, of the townspeople who had finally found their courage. And for the first time in years, he felt something like purpose stirring within him. The path ahead would be dangerous. Whitmore wouldn't surrender his power without a fight. But Daniel Mercer had spent his life in service to justice. Perhaps it was time to don that mantle once more, not as a federal judge, but as a man who recognized right from wrong. As he urged his horse faster along the trail Wade and Karen had taken, Daniel allowed himself a grim smile. Lisbeth would have approved. Karen and Sheriff Wade rode hard for an hour before slowing to rest their winded horses. They had followed game trails and dry creek beds, avoiding open ground where they might be spotted. "No sign of pursuit," Wade observed, scanning the landscape behind them. "Your friends must have delayed Jackson effectively." Karen's thoughts remained with Daniel and the others. What if they were hurt or killed? "Judge Mercer can handle himself," Wade assured her. "I've seen him face down worse than William Jackson." They continued at a slower pace, conserving their horses' strength. Karen clutched her bundle of possessions, acutely aware of the evidence hidden within. "Do you think it will be enough?" she asked, breaking a long silence. "The letter and the bullet, will it convince a judge?" Wade considered this. "It depends on the judge. Some are honest, some are in Whitmore's pocket." He glanced at her. "But there's more than one way to seek justice. If enough townspeople stand together." "Like Jenkins and the others did today," Karen said thoughtfully. "Exactly. Whitmore's power comes from fear and isolation. If people unite against him—" A shot rang out, the bullet whizzing past Wade's head. Both horses reared in panic as 3 riders emerged from a ravine ahead. "Down!" Wade shouted, drawing his revolver, as they both dismounted for cover. 2 more shots kicked up dirt near their position. Wade returned fire, forcing their attackers to seek shelter behind rocks. "Whitmore's men," he muttered, reloading quickly. Must have guessed our route. Karen pressed herself against a boulder, heart pounding. They were waiting for us. How? Someone knew we'd take this trail. Wade's expression darkened. We have a traitor in town. A voice called out from the ravine. Throw out the evidence, Miss Dalton, and you can ride away. This is your only chance. That's Cooper, Wade whispered. One of Whitmore's deputies. Karen's hand moved to the hidden evidence. If they know about it specifically, then Whitmore is desperate to destroy it, Wade finished. Which means it's more valuable than we thought. Another volley of shots forced them lower behind their cover. Karen could see their horses had bolted, leaving them stranded. We're pinned down, Wade acknowledged grimly. They'll flank us soon. Karen scanned their surroundings, noticing a narrow cleft in the rocks behind them. There, she pointed. We might be able to reach higher ground. Wade nodded. I'll cover you. Go. As he fired to keep their attackers occupied, Karen scrambled toward the opening. The narrow passage wound upward through the rocks, eventually emerging onto a small plateau that offered better visibility. Wade joined her moments later, breathing hard. Good eye, he complimented her. We can hold this position longer, but we're still outnumbered. How did you know? Karen asked suddenly. Know what? That I had evidence against Whitmore. I never told you what my father gave me. Wade's expression faltered slightly. I assumed based on what your father said before he died. Karen studied him, doubt creeping into her mind. You said throw out the evidence just now, not what are you carrying or what did Henry give you. You knew exactly what I had. Realization dawned as Wade's hand tightened on his gun. Karen, it was you, she whispered, backing away. You told Whitmore what my father knew. You're the traitor. Wade's youthful face hardened into something unrecognizable. Not a traitor, a practical man. Whitmore owns this territory, Karen. Standing against him is suicide. So you helped him murder my father. Her voice cracked with pain and betrayal. I didn't know they'd kill him, Wade protested. That wasn't part of the agreement. And what was your agreement? Money, power. The sheriff's office to start. Eventually, territorial marshal. Wade kept his gun trained on her. Whitmore rewards loyalty. Karen's back pressed against the rocky edge of the plateau. You pretended to help us. You rode with me to my father's burial. I needed to know if you had the evidence and where Mercer was keeping you. Wade held out his hand. Give it to me, Karen. Please, I don't want to hurt you, but I will if I have to. Sheriff, Cooper called from below. You got her? Working on it, Wade shouted back, never taking his eyes off Karen. Last chance, he said quietly. The evidence now. Karen glanced behind her, gauging the drop to a lower ledge. It was steep, but potentially survivable. You know what my father called you? She asked, buying time. A coward playing at bravery. He was right. Anger flashed across Wade's face. Your father was a drunk who sold out to Whitmore for whiskey money for 15 years. At least I got a badge and authority out of my bargain. As his attention wavered for a split second, Karen threw her bundle of possessions at his face and leapt backward off the plateau. She landed hard on the lower ledge, pain shooting through her ankle, but managed to keep her balance. Above, Wade cursed as he realized the evidence wasn't in the bundle. Karen half ran, half limped along the narrow ledge, searching for a path downward and away from her pursuers. A gunshot echoed through the ravine, followed by a cry of pain. Then another shot, and another. The exchange of gunfire continued for several seconds before falling silent. Karen pressed herself against the rock face, uncertain whether to continue or wait. Had Wade and Cooper killed each other in some dispute, or was someone else involved in the firefight? Karen! The voice calling her name from below was unmistakable. Daniel Mercer stood at the base of the rocky outcropping, revolver in hand. Behind him lay Cooper and another of Whitmore's men, both wounded but alive. "Daniel," she called back, relief flooding through her. "Wade is a traitor. He's working for Whitmore." "I know," Daniel replied grimly. "Can you climb down?" Karen examined the rock face. "I think so, but my ankle's hurt. Take it slow. I'll catch you if you fall." She began her careful descent, testing each foothold before committing her weight. Halfway down, loose stones gave way beneath her foot. She slipped, tumbling the remaining distance into Daniel's waiting arms. He caught her with surprising gentleness, lowering her carefully to the ground. "Are you all right?" Karen nodded, wincing as she tested her injured ankle. "It's just twisted, I think." She looked up at him anxiously. "The others at the cabin—" "Safe," he assured her. Jackson retreated after taking a bullet to the shoulder. The sound of movement drew their attention to the top of the ravine, where Wade had appeared, his gun trained on them. "It's over, Wade," Daniel called up to him. "Drop the gun." "Not a chance, Judge," Wade replied, his voice tight with desperation. "Whitmore will hang me if I fail." "And I'll hang you if you shoot," Daniel countered. "Your choice." For a tense moment, Wade seemed to consider his options. Then, with sudden decision, he turned and fled along the ridge. Daniel helped Karen to her horse, which had returned after the gunfire ceased. "We need to get to my ranch," he said. "It's defensible, and we can treat your ankle there." As they rode double, Karen leaning against Daniel's solid presence, she felt the weight of the day's revelations pressing upon her. Her father was dead, likely murdered. The sheriff she'd trusted was a traitor. Whitmore's corruption ran deeper than she'd imagined. Yet despite these blows, she didn't feel defeated. The townspeople's support, Daniel's unwavering assistance, and the evidence she carried gave her hope that justice might still be possible. "What happens now?" she asked, as they crested a rise overlooking Daniel's ranch in the distance. Daniel was silent for a moment before answering. "Now we gather our allies, secure the evidence, and prepare for Whitmore's next move." His voice hardened with determination. "And then we bring him down legally, if possible, by force, if necessary." Karen nodded, drawing strength from his resolve. "Thank you," she said softly, "for everything." Daniel didn't respond verbally, but his arm tightened slightly around her waist, a silent acknowledgement of their shared purpose and growing bond. As they approached the ranch, flames suddenly erupted from the main house, billowing smoke into the evening sky. Daniel reined in sharply, watching in horror as his home burned. "No," Karen whispered, understanding immediately what this meant. "Whitmore found us." Daniel's expression hardened into cold fury. "This ends now," he said, voice barely audible over the distant crackle of flames. "One way or another." End of Part 2 continues in Part 3. I've completed Part 2 of Justice on the Frontier, continuing the story of Karen Dalton and Daniel Mercer as they face mounting threats from Mayor Whitmore and his men. This section develops the central conflict while introducing several key plot developments. 1. The revelation of Henry Dalton's death, likely murdered to silence him. The community beginning to rally behind Karen through small acts of support. 3. Sheriff Wade's betrayal revealed as Whitmore's informant. 4. The first open confrontation between Daniel and Jackson's men. 5. The destruction of Daniel's ranch in retaliation. The narrative continues to build tension through multiple mini-cliffhangers and concludes with the major cliffhanger of Daniel's home being set ablaze, signaling that Whitmore is escalating his attacks against them. In this section, I've developed the Western setting with authentic details while deepening the relationship between Karen and Daniel through their shared determination to stand against corruption. The themes of justice, community, and redemption continue to strengthen as more townspeople find the courage to oppose Whitmore's tyranny. Would you like me to continue with Part 3, Retry DN OK? Next, Part 3, Edit, Justice on the Frontier. Karen stared in horror at the orange flames engulfing Daniel's home. The fire had already consumed most of the main structure, hungry tongues licking at the roof beams as they collapsed inward with terrible groans. Even from a distance, the heat pressed against her face, like an unwelcome hand. "Miguel," Daniel urged the horse forward, his voice tight with fear. "Elena." They galloped toward the burning ranch only to be met halfway by Miguel Rodriguez, leading several horses away from the flames. The man's face was smudged with soot, his shirt torn. "Judge!" Miguel called, relief evident in his voice. "Thanks be to God you are safe." Daniel reined in sharply. "What happened? Where's Elena?" "She is well, helping the others in the barn." Miguel gestured toward the outbuilding, which remained untouched by the fire. "Whitmore's men came an hour ago. 10 riders led by Wade." "Wade." Daniel repeated the name, bitter in his mouth. "They burned the house deliberately." Miguel nodded grimly. "Said it was a message, that next time it would be people, not property." He glanced at Karen. They were looking for Miss Dalton and something she carries. Karen's hand instinctively moved to her bodice, where the evidence remained hidden. "I'm so sorry," she said to Daniel. "This is my fault." Daniel shook his head once sharply. "This is Whitmore's doing, not yours." He dismounted, helping Karen down carefully to avoid putting weight on her injured ankle. "Come, we need to see who else is here." The barn had been converted into a makeshift refuge. Inside, Elena tended to an elderly Mexican woman Karen recognized from town, Senora Vasquez, who sold tamales from a small cart. Nearby sat the 3 men who had stood with Daniel at the Dalton cabin, Jenkins, Morton, and Reed. Their expressions were grim but determined. "Judge Mercer," Reed acknowledged, rising to his feet. "They hit your place after they failed to burn down the Dalton cabin. Said anyone who stands with you or Miss Dalton is an enemy of the town." "They threatened our families," Jenkins added quietly. "Morton's boy was roughed up this morning. My shop windows were smashed." Daniel's expression remained controlled, but Karen could see the muscle tightening in his jaw. "You should not have come here," he said, though his tone held no accusation. "Where else would we go?" Morton replied simply. "You stood for us. We stand for you." Elena approached, wrapping a shawl around Karen's shoulders. "Come, Miss Karen. Let me see to your ankle." As Elena helped Karen to a hay bale and began examining her injury, Daniel conferred with the men in low voices. Karen caught fragments of their conversation, plans for defense, concerns about supplies, debate over their next move. "The house is gone," Elena murmured, as she wrapped Karen's ankle with practiced hands. "But Judge Mercer has a root cellar beneath the barn. Food stored there, ammunition too." "How many people are here?" Karen asked, noticing others huddled in the shadowed corners of the barn. 15, Elena replied. "Mostly my people, Mexicans, who worked for ranches around Dry Creek. Whitmore's men have been driving us off, saying we no longer have permission to be on territorial land." Her dark eyes flashed with anger. "Land that was Mexico before your people took it." Karen nodded, understanding. "And now you're refugees on my account." "Not just your account." Elena tied off the bandage with a firm knot. "Judge Mercer has always treated us fairly. Paid proper wages, spoke for us when we had troubles in town." She glanced toward where Daniel stood. After his wife died, we thought he would become hard turn away from everyone. But the good heart remained even when he tried to hide it. Karen's gaze followed Elena's to Daniel. In the lantern light, his weathered face showed the strain of the day's events. Yet there was strength in his bearing, not the brittle strength of pride, but something deeper and more enduring. "Tell me about his wife," Karen said softly. "Lisbeth." Elena's expression softened. She was formidable, not beautiful in the way men usually want, but striking. Eyes that saw everything. She ran a station on the Underground Railroad during the war, helped escaped slaves reach Mexico. She lowered her voice. When she died, Judge Mercer lost his faith in justice. He resigned his position, came here to be alone. "Until now," Karen murmured. "Until you," Elena corrected gently. Before Karen could respond, Daniel approached, his expression grave. "We need to talk," he said, offering his hand to help her stand. "Privately." He led her to a small tack room at the rear of the barn, closing the door behind them. A single lantern cast long shadows across the walls, lined with saddles and bridles. The small space smelled of leather and oil, oddly comforting in its familiarity. "What Whitmore did today changes things," Daniel began without preamble. "This is no longer just about your land, or the evidence against him. He's declared war on anyone who opposes him." Karen nodded. "What do we do?" "The safest course would be for you to leave, take the evidence to Santa Fe, present it to the territorial governor." Daniel paced the small space. "I could arrange an escort and leave everyone here to face Whitmore's retribution." Karen shook her head firmly. "No, I won't run." A ghost of a smile touched Daniel's lips. "I thought you might say that." He reached into his coat and withdrew a folded document. "In that case, we need a different strategy." He spread the paper on a small table. Karen recognized it as a map of the Dry Creek region, detailed with property boundaries, water sources, and terrain features. "Whitmore's power comes from 3 sources," Daniel explained. "His control of the town council, his alliance with corrupt officials in Santa Fe, and his hired guns. We need to undermine all 3. How? By gathering more allies, securing irrefutable evidence, and preparing for a direct confrontation if necessary." Daniel's finger traced a line on the map. "The territorial circuit judge arrives in Socorro next week. Judge Hammond is a fair man untouched by Whitmore's influence. If we can bring our case before him instead of Whitmore's puppets in Santa Fe, Whitmore will try to stop us," Karen pointed out. "Undoubtedly, which is why we need to strengthen our position first." Daniel looked at her directly. "The people gathered here are a start, but we need more, particularly those with influence." Karen thought for a moment. "Harlan Reed has connections with other ranchers, and Jenkins is respected in town." "Good. We'll have them reach out." Daniel's expression grew more serious. "But there's something else you should know. Dr. Montgomery examined your father's body before burial. He found bruising on the neck hidden by his collar." Karen's breath caught. "Murder," she whispered, "almost certainly. Designed to look like he succumbed to the pneumonia." Daniel watched her carefully. "This is personal for you now. I need to know you can think clearly despite that." Karen straightened, her green eyes meeting his steadily. "My father was a flawed man, but he didn't deserve to die that way. I want justice, not vengeance." Daniel nodded, seemingly satisfied with her response. "There's one more thing." He hesitated, then reached into his coat again, withdrawing a small daguerreotype in a wooden frame. "This was in the house. Miguel managed to save it before the fire spread too far." He handed it to Karen. The image showed a woman with severe features, her hair pulled back tightly, her expression intense rather than beautiful. Beside her stood a younger Daniel, his face less weathered, but his eyes the same observant assessing. "Lisbeth," Karen said softly. "Yes." Daniel took the photograph back, his fingers tracing the edge of the frame. "She would have liked you." The simple statement carried more weight than any elaborate compliment. Karen felt something shift between them, not quite trust, which had already begun to form, but something more personal. An acknowledgement of connection. "Why did you really help me that day at the market post?" she asked. Daniel was silent for a long moment, his gaze fixed on his wife's image. "When I looked at you," he finally said, "I saw someone refusing to be broken by circumstance. It reminded me of her." He returned the photograph to his coat. "And it reminded me of who I used to be, before grief made me a hermit." Karen reached out impulsively, her hand covering his. "Thank you for telling me." Daniel looked down at their hands, then back to her face. Something unspoken passed between them, recognition perhaps of kindred spirits forged in different fires. The moment was broken by a sharp knock at the door. Miguel entered without waiting for a response, his expression urgent. "Riders coming," he announced, "from the direction of town." Daniel immediately moved to action, strapping on his gun belt. "How many?" "3 moving slowly. 1 appears injured." They followed Miguel to the barn entrance. Daniel positioned himself in front, revolver drawn, while Reed and Morton took up flanking positions with rifles. The approaching riders emerged from the darkness into the pool of lantern light spilling from the barn. Karen recognized Sheriff Wade, immediately slumped in his saddle, blood darkening his left side. Behind him rode Pastor Collins, looking distinctly uncomfortable on horseback. And a third man Karen didn't recognize, tall and distinguished, with an air of authority despite his trail-worn appearance. "That's Judge Hammond," Daniel murmured in surprise. "The circuit judge from Socorro." Daniel stepped forward, gun still raised. "That's far enough, Wade." The sheriff raised his hands weakly. "Not here to fight Mercer." His voice was strained with pain. "Came to warn you." "Warn us of what?" Daniel demanded, skeptical. Pastor Collins spoke up, his usual self-assurance notably diminished. "Whitmore plans to kill everyone here tonight. He's gathered 20 men, Jackson's gang and others. They'll be coming at dawn." Daniel's eyes narrowed. "And why would you betray your patron pastor?" "Because there are lines even I won't cross," Collins replied, his voice hollow. "Burning property is one thing. Mass murder is another." The third rider dismounted stiffly, approaching with careful steps. "Judge Mercer," he said formally. "I'm Circuit Judge William Hammond. I was in Dry Creek to prepare for next week's session when I witnessed disturbing events that suggest significant corruption in the local government." Daniel lowered his weapon slightly. "That's putting it mildly, Your Honor." Hammond nodded grimly. "Sheriff Wade approached me privately, confessed his role in Mayor Whitmore's schemes, and offered to testify in exchange for leniency." He gestured toward Wade's wound. "Whitmore discovered his change of heart and attempted to silence him permanently." Karen moved forward, studying Wade's pale face. "Why the sudden attack of conscience, Sheriff?" Wade met her gaze, his youthful features drawn with pain and shame. "Your father," he said quietly. "I didn't know Whitmore planned to kill him. When I found out..." He winced as a spasm of pain hit him. "Some bargains cost more than a man can live with." Daniel remained wary. "This could be a trap." "It's not," Collins insisted. "Whitmore believes we rode to Socorro to fetch territorial marshals. He doesn't know we came here instead." Judge Hammond straightened to his full height. "I've seen enough to convince me that an immediate judicial inquiry is warranted. But first, we must ensure the safety of everyone here. He turned to Daniel. I understand you were once a federal Judge Mercer. I may need to rely on your expertise in this matter. Daniel holstered his weapon, decision made. Bring them inside. Elena can tend to Wade's wound. He turned to Miguel. Post lookouts. If Whitmore's coming at dawn, we need to be ready. As they moved into the barn, Karen found herself studying Wade's haggard face. You sold us out, she said quietly. Why should we trust you now? Wade's eyes, glazed with pain, met hers directly. You shouldn't. But Whitmore killed your father as easily as swatting a fly. He'll do the same to everyone who stands against him. He grimaced. I was a fool to think he'd stop at fraud and intimidation. Karen wasn't ready to forgive, but she recognized the ring of truth in his words. If you survive your wound, you'll stand trial for your part in this. I know, Wade replied. It's why I brought Judge Hammond. Someone needs to document all of this legally. Inside the barn, Elena efficiently cleaned and bandaged Wade's gunshot wound, a through and through in his side that had bled profusely but wasn't immediately life-threatening. Meanwhile, Daniel conferred with Judge Hammond, showing him the evidence Karen had carried from her father. The judge examined the yellowed letter and bullet with careful attention. This is compelling, but not conclusive on its own, he admitted. We need Wade's testimony to corroborate the murder plot against Henry Dalton and witnesses to the land fraud. We have both, Daniel assured him, gesturing to the gathered townspeople. The question is whether we can hold this position until you can convene an official hearing. Hammond's expression was grave. If Whitmore truly means to attack at dawn with 20 armed men, our chances are slim. Then we need a different plan, Karen interjected, having overheard their conversation. One that doesn't involve a siege we can't win. All eyes turned to her. Karen felt a momentary hesitation, then squared her shoulders. Whitmore wants the evidence and me. What if we let him think he can get both? Daniel immediately shook his head. Absolutely not. Hear me out, Karen insisted. If Whitmore believes I'm alone and vulnerable, he might come himself rather than sending his men. With Judge Hammond hidden nearby to witness his actions, it's too dangerous, Daniel objected. It's our best chance, Karen countered. We're outnumbered and outgunned. We need to be smarter, not stronger. Pastor Collins, who had been listening quietly, spoke up. She's right. Whitmore's arrogance is his weakness. If he believes he can personally eliminate the threat Karen poses, Judge Hammond nodded slowly. A trap might work, if carefully planned. He turned to Daniel. What do you think, Judge Mercer? You know the terrain better than any of us. Daniel was silent for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Finally, he turned to the map spread on a nearby crate. There's a place, he said reluctantly, an old line cabin near Cottonwood Creek. Isolated but with good sight lines and multiple escape routes. He pointed to the location on the map. If Karen were to be seen traveling there seemingly alone, Whitmore would think she's vulnerable, Reed finished. Especially if word reached him that she and you had quarreled, that she'd left your protection. Daniel nodded grimly. But she wouldn't actually be alone. We'd have men positioned here, and here. His finger traced positions around the cabin. And Judge Hammond would be concealed inside witness to whatever Whitmore says or does. It could work, Hammond agreed, but it puts Miss Dalton at considerable risk. A risk I'm willing to take, Karen stated firmly. Daniel looked at her concern evident in his gray eyes. If anything goes wrong, it won't, she assured him with more confidence than she felt. Whitmore is used to bullying those weaker than himself. He won't expect resistance. After further discussion, they finalized the plan. Pastor Collins would return to town, spreading word that Karen had quarreled with Daniel and fled to the line cabin, taking the evidence with her. Wade would remain at the ranch, his wound too severe for travel. The others would position themselves according to Daniel's strategy, with Judge Hammond and Karen waiting at the cabin. As preparations began, Daniel drew Karen aside once more. "I don't like this plan," he said quietly. "I know," she replied, "but it's the right move." Daniel studied her face in the lantern light. "Your father would be proud of your courage." The unexpected praise brought a lump to Karen's throat. "I hope so. There's something else you should know." Daniel hesitated, then continued. "If Whitmore comes himself, he won't be taken alive. Men like him preferred death to disgrace." Karen absorbed this sobering assessment. "Then we'll need to be prepared for anything." Daniel nodded, his expression grave. "Just promise me one thing. If the situation turns, don't hesitate. Run. Your life is worth more than any evidence or land." The intensity in his eyes caught her off guard. This was more than the concern of an ally or even a friend. Karen found herself wondering what might have developed between them in different circumstances without the shadow of danger hanging over them. "I promise," she said softly. As dawn approached, they made final preparations. Karen changed into clothes. Elena provided a simple dress that would make her appear more vulnerable than she felt. The evidence was secured in a hidden pocket. Judge Hammond, despite his age, proved remarkably adaptable to their desperate plan. Pastor Collins departed first, his story prepared. The others would leave in small groups, taking different routes to avoid detection. Daniel would be the last to go, positioning himself closest to the cabin with the clearest line of sight. Before mounting her horse, Karen paused beside Daniel, who was checking his rifle one final time. "Daniel," she said quietly. He looked up, his weathered face solemn in the pre-dawn light. "Thank you," she continued, "not just for this, but for everything since that day at the market post. Whatever happens today, you've restored my faith that good men still exist in this world." Something shifted in his expression, a softening around the eyes, a brief vulnerability quickly masked. "Be careful," was all he said, but his hand brushed hers as he helped her mount, lingering for a moment longer than necessary. As Karen rode away toward the line cabin, the eastern sky beginning to lighten with the promise of dawn, she felt a curious blend of fear and determination. For the first time in her life, she wasn't facing adversity alone. Whatever happened in the hours ahead, that knowledge gave her strength she'd never known before. The line cabin stood in a small clearing near Cottonwood Creek, its weathered logs silvered by years of sun and wind. Built as a boundary marker when the ranches were first established, it had served as occasional shelter for cowboys working the distant ranges before falling into disuse. Inside, the single room was sparsely furnished with a rough-hewn table, 2 chairs, and a narrow cot against one wall. Dust covered every surface, disturbed now by Karen and Judge Hammond as they prepared their trap. "Whitmore will approach from the east," Hammond said, studying the terrain through the cabin's single window. "The rising sun will be at his back, making it harder for you to see him clearly." Karen nodded, arranging the room to their advantage. She positioned one chair facing the door where she would sit, apparently alone and vulnerable. Hammond would conceal himself behind a faded blanket they'd hung to section off a corner of the cabin. "Remember," the judge instructed, "we need him to incriminate himself verbally. Get him to admit to the murder of James Ellsworth, the forged land deed, your father's death, anything that confirms the written evidence. And if he simply tries to kill me instead of talking," Karen asked pragmatically. Hammond patted the revolver at his hip. "Then I intervene. But let's hope it doesn't come to that." A legal conviction is far preferable to more bloodshed. They had been in position for nearly an hour when the sound of approaching horses reached them. Karen's heart quickened, but she forced her breathing to remain steady. Judge Hammond slipped behind the blanket, his footsteps silent on the packed earth floor. Through the window, Karen could make out 3 riders approaching Mayor Whitmore, in the lead flanked by William Jackson and another of his hired guns. Whitmore's silver beard caught the morning light as he dismounted, straightening his coat with the fastidiousness that never deserted him even in such circumstances. Karen positioned herself in the chair, arranging her skirts to appear natural rather than staged. She kept her father's evidence visible on the table before her, a calculated risk to draw Whitmore in. The door opened without a knock. Whitmore stepped inside, removing his hat with mock courtesy. Jackson followed his wounded shoulder, apparently healed enough for him to handle the revolver now pointed at Karen. The third man remained outside, presumably keeping watch. "Miss Dalton," Whitmore greeted her, his tone conversational. "How convenient to find you here and alone. Pastor Collins mentioned you'd had a falling out with our esteemed former judge." Karen kept her expression neutral. "What do you want, Mayor?" Whitmore smiled thinly. "Direct as always. Very well." He gestured to the items on the table. "I want what belonged to your father, both the evidence he so unwisely preserved and the land that is rightfully mine." "Rightfully?" Karen challenged. "You forged my father's signature on that deed." "A mere technicality. The land would have been mine eventually, one way or another." Whitmore pulled out the second chair, seating himself across from her with unsettling casualness. "You see, Miss Dalton, progress requires certain accommodations. The railroad needs that land for the depot. The silver beneath it will fund Dry Creek's transformation into a proper city." "Built on murder and theft," Karen observed coldly. Whitmore's smile didn't waver. "Built on vision and determination, something your father lacked entirely." He leaned forward. "James Ellsworth lacked it too. He would have squandered the silver, sold it piecemeal to Eastern investors. I saw the bigger picture." "So you shot him in the back," Karen stated flatly. A flicker of surprise crossed Whitmore's face before he controlled it. "Your father told you that, did he? In one of his drunken ramblings? He saw you do it, by Cottonwood Creek 15 years ago." Whitmore's eyes narrowed slightly. "And you believe the word of a notorious drunkard?" "I believe the evidence," Karen replied, tapping the oilskin package. "Ellsworth's letter naming you as his partner and expressing fear for his safety. The bullet my father dug from the creek bank where you shot him." Jackson shifted impatiently. "Enough talk. Let's finish this and go." Whitmore raised a hand. "Patience, Mr. Jackson. Miss Dalton deserves to understand why her stubborn resistance is futile." He returned his attention to Karen. "Your father kept his silence for 15 years in exchange for whiskey money, a reasonable arrangement that could have continued indefinitely had he not developed an inconvenient attack of conscience." "So you had him killed," Karen said, her voice steady despite the rage building within her. "An unfortunate necessity." Whitmore shrugged. "The pneumonia was real enough. Nature simply needed a little assistance." Karen fought to keep her expression neutral. Behind the blanket, Judge Hammond would be recording every damning word. "And Wade?" she asked. "Did you try to kill him too when he turned against you?" Anger flashed across Whitmore's face. "Wade was a disappointment. I gave him opportunity, position, a future, and he repaid me with betrayal." He waved a dismissive hand. "It hardly matters now. Once we've concluded our business here, I'll deal with the remaining opposition, Judge Mercer included." "You'll never defeat Daniel," Karen said with quiet confidence. He's everything you pretend to be honorable, just respected, without needing to rule through fear. Whitmore's expression hardened. Honor, justice, quaint notions that accomplish nothing. Power and wealth are what matter in this world, Miss Dalton, something your precious Judge Mercer forgot when he buried his wife and his ambition simultaneously. He rose, extending his hand. Now the evidence, if you please. After which, Mr. Jackson will escort you to a waiting wagon. You'll be leaving the territory tonight alive if you cooperate fully. Karen made no move to comply. And if I refuse? Jackson stepped forward, gun leveled at her head. Then you'll join your father, miss. Simple as that. I wouldn't advise that course of action, Mr. Jackson. The new voice came from behind the blanket as Judge Hammond stepped into view, his revolver trained on Whitmore. Mayor Theodore Whitmore, you are under arrest for the murders of James Ellsworth and Henry Dalton, attempted murder of Sheriff James Wade, land fraud, corruption, and conspiracy. Whitmore's face contorted with rage. Hammond, what is the meaning of this, Justice Mayor? Something long overdue in Dry Creek. Hammond's steady gaze never wavered from Whitmore's face. Lower your weapon, Jackson. You're outnumbered. Jackson snorted. I count 2 guns against 2 judge. Not the kind of odds that worry me. Count again, came Daniel's voice from the doorway. He stood framed against the morning light, rifle raised and unwavering. Behind him, Karen could see Morton and Reed positioning themselves by the cabin's windows, their own weapons at the ready. For a tense moment, no one moved. Then Whitmore's composed facade cracked completely. Kill them, he screamed. Kill them all. Jackson swung his gun toward Hammond. The judge fired first, his bullet catching Jackson in the chest. The gunman staggered backward, firing wildly as he fell. His shot went wide, splintering the window frame. Outside, the third rider opened fire. The sharp crack of rifles answered him as Daniel's men returned fire. Whitmore, seeing his protection collapsing, lunged across the table at Karen. His weight bore her backward chair and all crashing to the floor. His hands closed around her throat, face contorted with murderous rage. You'll die here, he snarled. You and your precious evidence. Karen struggled against his grip, her vision beginning to darken at the edges. She clawed at his face, managed to gouge his eye. Whitmore howled, but didn't release her. Then his weight was suddenly gone. Daniel had crossed the room in 2 strides, hauling Whitmore off her with a strength born of cold fury. He slammed the mayor against the wall, forearm pressed against his throat. It's over, Whitmore, Daniel growled. The mayor's hand emerged from his coat with a small derringer. Before anyone could react, he fired directly into Daniel's side at point-blank range. Daniel grunted in pain, but didn't release his grip. With his free hand, he wrenched the derringer away and delivered a single devastating punch to Whitmore's jaw. The mayor crumpled to the floor, unconscious. Daniel! Karen cried, scrambling to her feet, as he staggered backward, blood spreading across his shirt. I'm all right, he managed, though his face had gone pale. See to Hammond. The judge had slumped against the wall, his own revolver still trained on Jackson's motionless form. Only winded, he assured them. The excitement is a bit much for my old heart. Outside, the gunfire had ceased. Reed appeared in the doorway, rifle lowered. Third man's dead, he reported grimly. No casualties on our side. Karen helped Daniel to the cot, unbuttoning his shirt to examine the wound. The bullet had entered his right side, the bleeding steady, but not pulsing, which suggested no major arteries had been hit. How bad? Daniel asked through gritted teeth. Bad enough? Karen replied, tearing strips from her petticoat to form a temporary bandage. But I don't think it hit anything vital. We need to get you to Dr. Montgomery. Hammond had recovered enough to bind Whitmore's hands behind his back with a length of rope. The mayor remained unconscious, a darkening bruise spreading across his jaw. "We've done it," the judge said with quiet satisfaction. "I heard everything. His confession to Ellsworth's murder, Henry Dalton's death, the land fraud, all of it admissible in court." Karen finished binding Daniel's wound as best she could. "Will it be enough? He still has influence in Santa Fe." "Not after today," Hammond assured her. "I've been investigating Whitmore for months, gathering evidence of his corruption from multiple sources. Your father's evidence was the final piece I needed." He looked at Daniel with newfound respect. "And Judge Mercer's involvement lends additional credibility to the case." Daniel winced as he sat up straighter. "What happens now?" "Now we return to town," Hammond said. "I'll convene an emergency session of the circuit court." With Whitmore and Jackson in custody and the evidence secured, justice can finally be served. Reed and Morton prepared a makeshift stretcher for Daniel, who protested the necessity until Karen fixed him with a stern look that brooked no argument. They loaded the still unconscious Whitmore onto his own horse, securing him firmly to prevent escape. Before they departed, Karen retrieved her father's evidence from the table. The oilskin package had been partially crushed in the struggle, but its contents remained intact, the physical proof of crimes committed 15 years ago that had set in motion all that followed. "Your father would be proud," Daniel said quietly, as Karen helped adjust his position on the stretcher. "Of what?" she asked. "Nearly getting myself killed." A ghost of a smile touched his lips. "Of standing up for what's right, no matter the cost." His hand caught hers. "I know I am." The simple words affected Karen more deeply than any elaborate praise. She squeezed his hand in response, unable to find words for the emotions welling within her. As their unusual procession made its way back toward Dry Creek, Karen rode beside Daniel's stretcher, watching his face for signs of increasing pain. The bullet wound was serious, though hopefully not fatal if infection could be prevented. "What will you do now?" Daniel asked after they had ridden in silence for some time. "With your father's land, I mean." Karen considered the question. "I'm not sure. Rebuild, perhaps?" She glanced at him. "What about you? Will you return to your burned-out ranch?" Daniel's eyes met hers. "I've been thinking about that. A ranch needs a house. A house needs building. And I recall your father was once a fine carpenter." "He was," Karen agreed, uncertain where Daniel was leading. "You have his skills," Daniel continued. "I've seen how you repaired that cabinet in your cabin, the careful joining of the wood." He paused. "Perhaps we could rebuild together. Both properties." The suggestion held implications beyond the practical ones. Karen felt warmth spreading through her chest that had nothing to do with the morning sun. "I'd like that," she said softly. They crested a rise overlooking Dry Creek. The town spread below them in the clear morning light. From this distance, it looked peaceful, ordinary, a typical frontier settlement going about its daily business, unaware that everything was about to change. Judge Hammond rode up beside them. "Ready, Miss Dalton? Once we enter town, things will move quickly." Karen nodded, straightening her shoulders. "I'm ready, Your Honor." As they descended toward Dry Creek, Karen felt a curious sense of homecoming mixed with trepidation. This town had been her prison for so long, a place of judgment and exclusion. Now she returned not as Henry Dalton's shamed daughter, but as a woman who had helped bring its corrupt leader to justice. Whatever happened next, nothing would be the same again. She glanced at Daniel, finding strength in his steady presence despite his injury. Together, they had stood against tyranny and prevailed. Perhaps together, they could build something new from the ashes of the past. The town bell began to ring as they approached an alarm calling citizens to witness something momentous. Karen took a deep breath, preparing herself for what lay ahead. The final chapter of Theodore Whitmore's reign was about to be written, and she would help write it. News spread through Dry Creek like wildfire. Mayor Whitmore captured. William Jackson dead. Judge Hammond himself presiding over an emergency court session. Citizens gathered in the street, their expressions a mixture of confusion, disbelief, and dawning hope. Dr. Montgomery immediately took charge of Daniel, ordering him transported to the doctor's home for treatment. Karen reluctantly left his side, knowing her presence was required at the courthouse to present the evidence. The courthouse, a modest two-story building that also housed the jail, quickly filled beyond capacity. Judge Hammond, now wearing his official robes brought from Socorro, called the emergency session to order with grave authority. Karen sat in the front row, the oilskin package containing her father's evidence laid carefully on her lap. Beside her sat Pastor Collins, his usual confidence replaced by a subdued demeanor. He had chosen his side at last, agreeing to testify about Whitmore's corruption and his own complicity in it. Whitmore himself sat at the defendant's table, now conscious, but disheveled, his customary dignity stripped away. He glared at Karen with undisguised hatred, but she met his gaze steadily, refusing to be intimidated any longer. Sheriff Wade was present as well, pale from blood loss but determined to testify. He nodded slightly to Karen as their eyes met across the crowded room, not seeking forgiveness but acknowledging the justice they both now served. Judge Hammond's voice cut through the murmurs of the assembled townspeople. This court is convened to address serious allegations against Mayor Theodore Whitmore, including but not limited to murder, attempted murder, land fraud, corruption, and conspiracy. He outlined the charges methodically, his authoritative tone silencing even the most skeptical observers. When he called Karen as the first witness, she rose, with quiet dignity, carrying her father's evidence to the witness stand. For the next hour she testified about what her father had witnessed 15 years ago, the evidence he had preserved, and the events of recent days. Her voice remained steady even when describing her father's murder and her own near death at Whitmore's hands. The mayor's attorney, hastily summoned from his office, attempted to discredit her testimony by referencing her father's alcoholism and unreliability. Judge Hammond allowed the questioning, but watched with narrowed eyes as Karen refused to be rattled. "Miss Dalton," the attorney pressed, "isn't it true that your father was known throughout the territory as a drunkard, whose word couldn't be trusted?" Karen met his gaze directly. "My father was many things, sir. He was a skilled carpenter who built half the homes in this town. He was a Confederate soldier who returned broken from a war he didn't fully understand. He was a husband whose wife left him, and a father who, despite his failings, taught me the difference between right and wrong." She leaned forward slightly. "And on April 12, 1858, he was a witness to murder, a truth he carried for 15 years, first in silence, bought with whiskey, then in evidence, preserved against the day when justice might finally be possible." A murmur ran through the courtroom. The attorney, sensing the shift in sentiment, redirected his attack. "And this supposed evidence, a bullet that could have come from anywhere, a letter that proves nothing beyond a business dispute, this is what you offer as proof of murder?" "No, sir," Karen replied calmly. "I offer it as corroboration of testimony mine Sheriff Wade's, Pastor Collins's, and Judge Mercer's when he is well enough to appear. Together, along with Mayor Whitmore's own confession witnessed by Judge Hammond, it forms a complete picture of corruption and violence that has poisoned this town for far too long. When she returned to her seat, Karen felt drained but satisfied. One by one, the other witnesses took the stand. Wade confessing his role in Whitmore's schemes, Collins admitting to witnessing the forgery of Henry Dalton's signature, Dr. de Montgomery describing the evidence of strangulation he'd found on Henry's body. Throughout it all, Whitmore sat in stony silence, his initial rage hardening into cold calculation. When finally called to testify in his own defense, he rose with a semblance of his former dignity. "Citizens of Dry Creek," he began, ignoring the judge and addressing the spectators directly. "Everything I have done, I did for the future of this town. The railroad, the silver mine, the progress that would have lifted all of you from frontier obscurity to prosperity. These were my goals." Judge Hammond rapped his gavel. "Mr. Whitmore, address your remarks to the court." Whitmore continued as if he hadn't heard. "Ask yourselves who has truly served your interests, me, who brought investment and opportunity, or these conspirators who would keep Dry Creek a backwater settlement dominated by Mexican laborers and governed by Eastern morality." Murmurs spread through the courtroom, some supportive, others angry. Hammond rapped his gavel again, harder. "Mr. Whitmore, you will confine your testimony to the charges at hand, or you will be held in contempt." Whitmore finally turned to the judge, his mask of civility slipping. "Contempt. I hold this entire proceeding in contempt. This is not justice. It's a coup orchestrated by Judge Mercer and his Mexican allies to seize control of what I built." As Whitmore's composure disintegrated completely, his testimony devolved into a tirade of accusations and self-justification. Far from helping his case, his behavior confirmed for many what they had long suspected, that beneath the mayor's polished exterior lurked a man consumed by ambition and devoid of moral restraint. Judge Hammond allowed the outburst to continue briefly before ordering the bailiff to return Whitmore to his seat. The mayor's attorney, recognizing the damage done, rested his case with visible resignation. After brief deliberation, Hammond delivered his verdict, his voice ringing through the hushed courtroom. "Theodore Whitmore, this court finds you guilty of the murder of James Ellsworth, the murder of Henry Dalton, the attempted murder of Sheriff James Wade, land fraud, corruption, and conspiracy." He paused, surveying the packed room. "The evidence is overwhelming, and your own words condemning. I hereby sentence you to hang until dead, the execution to be carried out in 1 week's time." The pronouncement sent a shock wave through the assembled citizens. Though the verdict had seemed inevitable, given the evidence, the reality of seeing their mayor sentenced to death struck home with brutal force. As Whitmore was led away to the jail, his face a mask of hatred and disbelief, Karen felt no triumph, only a weary sense of closure. Justice had been served, but at tremendous cost. Her father's life, Daniel's wound, homes burned, community divided. Judge Hammond approached her as the courtroom began to empty. "Miss Dalton, there is the matter of your father's property. With the fraudulent deed, invalidated ownership reverts to you as his heir." Karen nodded, too emotionally exhausted to feel any satisfaction in this victory. "Thank you, Your Honor." "There's more," Hammond continued. "The investigation revealed that the silver vein Whitmore and Ellsworth discovered extends significantly onto your land. You may soon find yourself a wealthy woman." The irony wasn't lost on Karen. After years of struggling to survive, of being judged and ostracized for her poverty, she now stood to inherit considerable wealth. Yet what she valued most at that moment wasn't silver or land, but the man lying wounded in the doctor's house, a man who had seen her dignity when others saw only shame. "May I go to Judge Mercer now?" she asked simply. Hammond nodded understanding in his eyes. "Of course. I believe Dr. Montgomery has completed surgery to remove the bullet." Karen made her way through the dispersing crowd, acknowledging the nods and murmured greetings from townspeople who had previously shunned her. Their sudden respect felt hollow after years of judgment, but she recognized it as a beginning, a chance for healing, both for herself and the community. At the doctor's house, she found Daniel awake but weak, his side heavily bandaged. His gray eyes brightened when she entered the room. "The verdict?" he asked, his voice hoarse. "Guilty on all counts," she replied, taking the chair beside his bed. "Sentencing is set for 1 week from today." Daniel nodded slightly. "Hammond is thorough. He'll make sure everything is legally unassailable." "How are you feeling?" Karen asked, noting the pallor of his skin. "Like I've been shot," he replied dryly, then softened his tone. "The doctor says I'll recover fully with time and rest." "Good." Karen took his hand gently. "Because we have houses to rebuild. Remember?" A smile touched his lips. "I remember." They sat in comfortable silence for a moment, the events of the past days settling around them like dust after a storm. "What happens now?" Karen finally asked. "For the town, I mean." Daniel considered this. "Hammond will appoint an interim mayor until elections can be held. The railroad will still come through, though perhaps not exactly where Whitmore planned. The silver will be mined, but with proper claims and fair distribution of profits. And the people who supported him, who stood by while he corrupted everything he touched, some will leave unwilling to face their complicity. Others will adapt, convince themselves they always suspected something was wrong." Daniel's expression grew thoughtful. "Communities are like people, Karen. They can change, grow, learn from their mistakes. Dry Creek deserves that chance." Karen wasn't entirely convinced, but she nodded. "And us? What happens to us now?" Daniel's fingers tightened around hers. "That depends on what you want." "I want—" Karen hesitated, then continued with quiet certainty. "I want to build something that lasts. Something honest and good. A home where no one is judged for things they cannot help." Recognition flickered in Daniel's eyes. "Your mother's words." Karen nodded, surprised that he remembered her mention of them. "It's a worthy ambition," Daniel said softly, "one I'd be honored to help you achieve." The moment was interrupted by Dr. Montgomery entering to check on his patient. Karen released Daniel's hand reluctantly, rising to give the doctor space to work. "I should let you rest," she said. "Elena has offered me a place to stay until I decide what's next." Daniel nodded, though something like disappointment crossed his face. "Come back tomorrow." "I will," she promised. As Karen left the doctor's house, the setting sun painted Dry Creek in golden light, softening its rough edges and harsh angles. The town looked different now, not because it had changed physically, but because she viewed it through new eyes. For the first time since her mother left, Karen felt the possibility of belonging here, of creating a life not defined by her father's failings or others' judgments. Whether that life would include Daniel Mercer remained to be seen, but the potential existed, a tender shoot of possibility emerging from ground once thought barren. She walked slowly toward Elena's small house on the outskirts of town, where the Mexican community had established itself despite Whitmore's hostility. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, rebuilding, healing, finding her place in a transformed Dry Creek. But tonight, she would rest secure in the knowledge that justice had been served. and that she had played a part in making it possible. The stars were beginning to appear overhead, bright points of light in the darkening sky. Karen remembered something her father had told her long ago in one of his rare, sober moments. "Stars don't judge, girl. They shine on saints and sinners alike." Perhaps Dry Creek could learn to do the same. The week that followed passed in a blur of activity. Judge Hammond appointed Harlan Reed as interim mayor, a choice that surprised many, but proved immediately effective. Reed's practical approach and lack of political ambition made him ideal for guiding the town through its transition. Sheriff Wade, once his wound had sufficiently healed, resigned his position. Before leaving Dry Creek, he stopped at Dr. Montgomery's house where Daniel was recovering. "I came to say goodbye," Wade said awkwardly, standing at the foot of Daniel's bed. "And to apologize, for whatever that's worth." Daniel studied the younger man thoughtfully. "Where will you go? Montana, maybe, or Oregon, somewhere I can start fresh." Wade shifted uncomfortably. "Hammond reduced my sentence in exchange for testimony. 2 years in territorial prison instead of 10. "A fair bargain," Daniel acknowledged. "When you're released, remember this redemption is possible, but it must be earned through actions, not words." Wade nodded solemnly. "You taught me that once before, Judge. I should have listened better." He turned to leave, then paused. "Take care of her. She deserves better than this town has given her." After Wade's departure, Daniel reflected on the young man's journey from promising lawman to corrupt official and back to some semblance of honor. People could change for worse, yes, but also for better. It was a truth he'd nearly forgotten during his years of self-imposed isolation. Karen visited daily, bringing news of the town's transformation. Pastor Collins had resigned his position, replaced by a younger minister with less rigid views. The Mexican community under Elena's leadership was gaining recognition and representation in town affairs. Plans for the railroad depot had been modified to accommodate multiple landowners rather than concentrating power in one man's hands. On the morning of Whitmore's scheduled execution, Karen arrived earlier than usual. Daniel had progressed to sitting in a chair by the window, his recovery steady, though not as swift as he might have wished. "They're building the gallows," she said without preamble, her expression troubled. Daniel nodded. "Justice requires completion." "I know, it's just—" Karen hesitated. "After everything he did, I should want to see him hang, but I find no satisfaction in it, only as sadness for what might have been if he'd used his intelligence and determination for good instead of self-interest." "That capacity for compassion is why you're nothing like him," Daniel observed quietly. "Even in victory you see the humanity in your enemy." Karen sat beside him, her hands restless in her lap. "Will you attend the execution?" "No." Daniel's tone was firm. "I've witnessed enough death in my time as judge. I'll not watch another, even one, as deserved as Whitmore's." "Nor will I," Karen decided. "Instead, I thought we might visit your ranch. Miguel has been clearing the burned timber preparing for rebuilding. He says the foundation is still sound." The suggestion lifted Daniel's spirits. Though still weak from his wound, he was growing increasingly restless with confinement. Dr. Montgomery might object. "I've already spoken with him," Karen replied with a smile. "He agrees that fresh air would do you good, provided you don't overexert yourself." Later that morning, as Dry Creek gathered for the grim spectacle of Whitmore's execution, Karen and Daniel rode slowly out of town in the opposite direction. Miguel had prepared a wagon with blankets and cushions to make the journey as comfortable as possible for Daniel. They spoke little during the trip, each lost in private thoughts about all that had occurred and what might lie ahead. When they reached Daniel's property, the burned shell of his home came into view, a blackened skeleton against the clear blue sky. Miguel had indeed been busy. The charred debris had been cleared away, revealing the stone foundation that remained largely intact. Nearby stacks of fresh-cut timber waited ready for the work of rebuilding. "Elena says we can stay in the barn until the house is complete," Karen said as they surveyed the scene. "It will be rough living, but better than town with all its memories." Daniel turned to her, noting her use of "we" with quiet pleasure. "You're certain this is what you want? Your father's land has the silver. You could sell it, go anywhere, start fresh." Karen shook her head. "I've spent my life being defined by my father first, by his drinking, then by his debts, finally by his evidence against Whitmore. It's time I defined myself." She met his gaze directly. "And I choose to be here rebuilding something worthy, alongside someone I respect." The simple declaration, devoid of flowery sentiment, but rich with meaning, touched Daniel deeply. For years after Lisbeth's death, he had existed rather than lived, going through the motions of survival without purpose or connection. Karen Dalton, with her quiet strength and unflinching integrity, had awakened something he'd thought long buried. "Then we'll rebuild," he said simply. "Both properties, both lives." As they sat together in the wagon, looking out over the land that would become their shared future, Daniel felt a sense of rightness that had eluded him for too long. There would be challenges ahead: physical recovery, the practical work of construction, navigating the complex emotions growing between them. But for the first time in years, he looked forward to those challenges, rather than merely enduring them. In Dry Creek, a chapter was ending with Whitmore's execution. Here, on this scorched but resilient land, a new one was beginning, written not in blood and corruption, but in honest labor and shared purpose. The sun climbed higher, warming the air despite the early autumn chill. In the distance, a hawk circled lazily against the vast New Mexico sky. Life continued as it always did on the frontier, indifferent to human drama, yet somehow affirming the persistence of hope in even the harshest circumstances. Daniel reached for Karen's hand, finding it already extended toward his. Their fingers intertwined, a silent promise exchanged in the simple contact. Whatever came next, they would face it together, two people who had found in each other the courage to begin again. End of Part 3 continues in Part 4. I've completed Part 3 of Justice on the Frontier, developing the story through its dramatic midpoint and the first major confrontation with antagonist Mayor Whitmore. This section focuses on several key developments. 1. The establishment of Daniel's ranch as a refuge for those opposing Whitmore after his home is burned. 2. The surprise arrival of Judge Hammond and Sheriff Wade's change of heart. Karen's bold plan to trap Whitmore and gather conclusive evidence. 4. The dramatic confrontation at the line cabin where Daniel is shot while protecting Karen. 5. The formal trial and Whitmore's conviction. Throughout this section, I've deepened the relationship between Karen and Daniel while maintaining the Western setting with authentic details. Their connection grows more intimate through shared danger and mutual respect, though still maintaining the emotional restraint appropriate to the era and characters. The climactic confrontation delivers on the building tension while setting up the final sections of the story, where we'll explore the aftermath of Whitmore's defeat and the rebuilding of both physical homes and emotional lives. Would you like me to continue with Part 4, Retry DNOK? Next part, Edit Number Justice on the Frontier. The execution took place at noon, as the autumn sun stood directly overhead, casting no shadows. Theodore Whitmore met his fate with the same cold arrogance that had characterized his rule over Dry Creek, refusing both final words and spiritual comfort. As the trapdoor opened beneath his feet, a chapter in the town's history closed with brutal finality. Miles away, Daniel Mercer and Karen Dalton sat in comfortable silence beside the foundation of what would soon become Daniel's new home. They had chosen not to witness Whitmore's hanging, preferring instead to focus on rebuilding rather than retribution. "Do you think it will change anything?" Karen asked, breaking the quiet. "His death?" Daniel considered the question carefully. "Not immediately. The corruption he fostered won't disappear overnight, but it creates an opportunity for something better to take root." They watched as Miguel and several Mexican workers prepared the site for construction, clearing the last of the debris and measuring for the new foundation posts. The day was crisp but pleasant, the New Mexico sky a perfect azure expanse above them. "I've been thinking about my father's land," Karen said after a while. "Judge Hammond says the silver deposit is substantial." Daniel nodded. "Will you develop it?" "I'm considering it, but differently than Whitmore would have." Her green eyes held a new confidence as she outlined her vision. A properly managed mine could provide steady work for years. Fair wages, safe conditions, profits shared with the workers rather than concentrated in one person's hands. Daniel smiled slightly. "Sounds revolutionary for these parts." "Perhaps it's time for revolution," Karen replied, then tempered her tone. "A quiet one at least. One built on fairness rather than greed." As they continued their discussion, a rider approached from the direction of town. They recognized Jenkins, the apothecary, his usually stoic face animated with urgency. "Judge Mercer, Miss Dalton," he called, dismounting before his horse had fully stopped. "There's trouble in town." Daniel straightened, wincing slightly as the movement pulled at his healing wound. "What kind of trouble?" "Jackson's men," Jenkins explained breathlessly. 5 of them rode in after the execution armed to the teeth. They're claiming Whitmore's property and businesses as payment for services rendered. Reed tried to stop them, but they've taken over the saloon and threatened to burn the town if anyone interferes. Karen exchanged a concerned glance with Daniel. "I thought Jackson's men would have fled after his death." "They should have," Daniel agreed grimly. "But men like that smell opportunity in chaos." He turned to Jenkins. "Where's Judge Hammond?" "Left for Socorro this morning after the execution. Said he'd return with territorial marshals in 3 days." Daniel's expression hardened. 3 days is too long. Those men could destroy half the town by then." Despite his injury, Daniel insisted on returning to Dry Creek immediately. Karen protested, concerned about his wound reopening, but recognized the determination in his eyes. "If I go with you," she bargained, "and you promise not to attempt anything foolish alone." Daniel agreed reluctantly, and they set out with Jenkins, leaving Miguel to continue work on the foundation. The ride back to town was tense, each lost in thoughts of what awaited them. Dry Creek appeared deceptively normal as they approached, but Karen quickly noticed the unusual stillness. The streets were nearly empty, doors closed, shutters drawn despite the pleasant weather. A knot of armed men lounged outside the Frontier Saloon, which had been Whitmore's most profitable business. Jenkins led them to the doctor's house, where Harlan Reed and several other town leaders had gathered. Reed's face bore a fresh bruise, his left eye swollen nearly shut. "Judge Mercer," he greeted Daniel with evident relief. "Thank God you've come." Dr. Montgomery immediately objected to Daniel's presence. "You should be resting, not riding around playing hero." "Later, Doctor." Daniel dismissed the concern, turning to Reed. "Tell me exactly what happened." Reed explained that immediately following Whitmore's execution, 5 of Jackson's remaining men had ridden into town, led by a gunslinger named Caleb Harker. They claimed that Whitmore had signed over his properties to Jackson as payment, and with Jackson dead, they were claiming inheritance. It's nonsense legally, Reed concluded, but they've got the guns to back their claim for now. And they've got hostages, added Morton the blacksmith. My boy Tom was in the saloon when they took it over, and Mary Jenkins was delivering medicines to Widow Parker next door. Jenkins's face paled at this news. My Mary, you didn't tell me. We were about to, Reed assured him. We've been trying to figure out how to get them out safely. Daniel absorbed this information, his expression grave. How many men does the town have who can handle weapons? A dozen, maybe, Reed estimated. But they're not gunfighters, just ordinary citizens. And these men with Harker, killers every one, Morton said grimly. They rode with Jackson for years. Rumor has it Harker's personally responsible for at least 15 deaths. Karen, who had remained silent during this exchange, finally spoke. So we're outmatched in terms of firepower and experience. Daniel nodded. A direct confrontation would be suicide. We need another approach. As they debated options, Pastor Collins arrived, his normally immaculate appearance disheveled. Since testifying against Whitmore, he had withdrawn from public life, his authority in the town diminished, but not entirely gone. I've spoken with Harker, Collins announced without preamble. He's willing to negotiate. All eyes turned to him. Negotiate what? Daniel asked skeptically. He says if the town acknowledges his claim to Whitmore's properties and businesses, he'll release the hostages and maintain order. Collins's distaste for the arrangement was evident in his tone. Order meaning his own brand of tyranny, Karen observed. Daniel shook his head. Whitmore couldn't legally transfer property he obtained through fraud. And even if he could, no court would recognize a verbal agreement with a known criminal. Harker doesn't care about legality, Collins pointed out. He cares about power and profit. Right now, he has both. The room fell silent as they considered their limited options. A frontal assault would likely result in bloodshed, including the hostages. Waiting for territorial marshals meant giving Harker 3 days to strengthen his position. There might be another way, Karen said slowly, an idea forming. One that uses Harker's greed against him. All eyes turned to her. Karen outlined her plan, a dangerous gambit that would require precise timing and no small amount of luck. As she spoke, Daniel's expression shifted from concern to reluctant admiration. It could work, he acknowledged when she finished. But it puts you at significant risk. No more than anyone else, Karen countered. And I have the most legitimate reason to approach him. After further discussion and refinement of the plan, they agreed it was their best option given the circumstances. Preparations began immediately, with Reed gathering the most reliable townsmen, while Morton crafted the special equipment they would need. Karen spent the afternoon with Elena, who helped her prepare for her role. By dusk, everything was in place. Daniel insisted on positioning himself closest to the saloon, despite his injury. I won't be sidelined while you put yourself in danger, he told Karen firmly as they made final arrangements. She studied his face in the fading light, noting the lines of pain around his eyes, but also the unwavering determination. Just remember your promise, she reminded him. Nothing foolish. As darkness fell, Karen approached the Frontier Saloon alone, dressed in her finest clothes, a dark blue dress borrowed from Elena, her hair arranged carefully beneath a small hat. She carried a leather portfolio containing documents, her stride purposeful despite her racing heart. The armed men lounging on the porch straightened as she approached, hands moving instinctively toward their weapons. I'm here to see Mr. Harker, Karen announced with a confidence she didn't entirely feel. Regarding the matter of property rights, one of the men spat tobacco juice near her feet. And who might you be, Miss Karen Dalton, owner of the silver deposit Whitmore was so desperate to acquire? She held up the portfolio. I have a business proposition for Mr. Harker. The men exchanged glances, then one nodded toward the door. Wait here. Minutes later, she was escorted inside. The saloon's main room was dimly lit, smelling of whiskey, tobacco, and unwashed bodies. Several townspeople sat rigid against one wall, clearly hostages. Karen recognized Tom Morton and Mary Jenkins among them, along with 3 others. At a corner table sat Caleb Harker, a lean, weather-beaten man with cold eyes and a carefully trimmed mustache. Unlike his rough companions, he affected the appearance of a gentleman, though the effect was undermined by the twin revolvers holstered at his hips. "Miss Dalton," he drawled, gesturing to the chair across from him. "I've heard about you, the drunk's daughter who brought down Mayor Whitmore." Karen took the offered seat, placing her portfolio on the table. "And I've heard about you, Mr. Harker, William Jackson's second-in-command, now apparently his successor." Harker smiled thinly. "Direct. I appreciate that in business dealings." He poured whiskey into 2 glasses, sliding one toward her. "What's this proposition you've brought me?" Karen ignored the drink. "I understand you're claiming ownership of Whitmore's holdings based on an agreement with Jackson." "That's right. Signed and witnessed, though the documentation is currently misplaced." His smile suggested he knew perfectly well no such documentation existed. "Such claims are legally questionable," Karen observed, "especially since much of what Whitmore owned was obtained through fraud." Harker's eyes hardened. "I'm not particularly concerned with legal niceties, Miss Dalton. I have possession which counts for more in these parts." "Perhaps," Karen conceded, "but possession without legitimacy is tenuous. The territorial governor will send marshals eventually." "By which time I'll be well established," Harker countered confidently. "Now, was there a proposition somewhere in this conversation, or did you come merely to warn me of distant threats?" Karen opened her portfolio, removing several documents. "I own the largest silver deposit in the region, verified by territorial geologists last week. What Whitmore sought for years is legally mine." Harker's interest visibly sharpened. "Go on. I need capital and protection to develop it properly. You need legitimacy and a more profitable venture than running a saloon." Karen spread the papers before him. "I'm proposing a partnership. My silver, your management. Legal documentation that would withstand scrutiny from territorial authorities." For several long moments, Harker studied her with calculating eyes. "Why would you offer this to me rather than some Eastern mining company? Because you're here now with the means to begin immediately. Because a local operation keeps profits in the territory rather than shipping them east." Karen leaned forward slightly. "And because I prefer dealing with the devil I can see rather than the one I can't." Harker laughed, a surprisingly genuine sound. "Well played, Miss Dalton." He began examining the documents, his expression growing increasingly interested. "These profit projections, they're substantial." "Conservative estimates, actually," Karen replied. "With proper development, yields could be significantly higher." As Harker immersed himself in the papers, Karen glanced discreetly toward the hostages. Mary Jenkins caught her eye briefly, understanding passing between them. The older woman subtly touched the brooch at her collar, the signal that all was prepared. "I'll need to consult with my associates," Harker said finally. "But this has potential." He rose, gathering the documents. "Wait here." As soon as Harker disappeared into a back room with 2 of his men, Karen moved swiftly. From her sleeve, she withdrew a small vial provided by Jenkins, a powerful sedative, typically used for surgical procedures, now mixed into a colorless, odorless solution. She poured it into the whiskey pitcher on the table, then returned to her seat, just as the remaining guard glanced her way. She smiled pleasantly, folding her hands on the table in a picture of patience. Minutes later, Harker returned, his expression satisfied. "My associates agree the proposal has merit." He refilled his glass from the doctored pitcher. "To new partnerships." Karen raised her untouched glass in response, but didn't drink. Harker downed his whiskey in one swallow, then poured another. "There's just one detail to clarify," Karen said, watching as he consumed the second glass. "The matter of the hostages. I can hardly conduct business with someone holding my neighbors captive." Harker waved a dismissive hand, already showing signs of the sedative's effect, as his eyelids grew heavy. "Insurance policy. They'll be released once our arrangement is formalized." His words began to slur. He shook his head as if to clear it, looking suspiciously at his glass. What have you—" Before he could complete the thought, he slumped forward onto the table, unconscious. Almost simultaneously, the remaining guards began to stagger their own drinks, similarly doctored by Mary Jenkins, who had managed to access the serving tray while pretending to comfort another hostage. Karen moved quickly to the window, giving the signal 3 short flashes with a small mirror. Within moments, Daniel entered through the front door, followed by Reed Morton and several other townsmen, all armed. "It worked," Karen said with relief, directing them to the unconscious Harker. "They should remain sedated for hours." Daniel checked Harker's pulse, then nodded to Reed. "Secure them in the jail. Post guards around the clock until the marshals arrive." As the townsmen disarmed and removed Harker and his men, Daniel turned to Karen. "That was extremely risky," he said quietly. "If Harker had suspected anything—" "But he didn't," she replied. "Men like him are predictable in their greed. The prospect of controlling a silver mine was too tempting to question." Daniel's expression softened. "You were magnificent." The simple praise coming from a man so sparing with compliments warmed Karen more than any elaborate flattery could have. Together, they helped the released hostages, ensuring everyone was unharmed before finally stepping out onto the porch of the saloon. The town had emerged from behind closed doors, citizens gathering in the street, as word spread of Harker's capture. Reed addressed them briefly, explaining that the threat was contained and that territorial marshals would arrive within days to take the prisoners to Santa Fe. As the crowd dispersed, Karen noticed Daniel's pallor, the way he leaned subtly against a porch post for support. His wound was clearly paining him after the day's exertions. "You need rest," she said firmly, allowing no argument as she helped him to Dr. Montgomery's house. The doctor was predictably displeased with his patient's activities, but reported that, miraculously, the wound showed no signs of reopening or infection. "Pure luck," he grumbled as he changed the bandages, "not to be tested again any time soon." Later, as Daniel rested in the doctor's spare room, Karen sat beside him, recounting the details of Harker's capture. "The plan was yours," Daniel reminded her. "You should be proud." Karen shook her head. "It was a community effort. Jenkins providing the sedative, Mary getting it into their drinks, Morton creating the signaling mirror, Reed organizing the men." She smiled slightly. "It seems Dry Creek can function quite effectively when united against a common threat." "A lesson worth remembering," Daniel agreed. He studied her face in the lamplight. "You've changed since that day at the market post." "How so?" "You're more confident, more willing to lead, rather than endure." His gray eyes held genuine admiration. "Though your dignity was always present even then." Karen considered this assessment. Perhaps I simply needed to be seen, truly seen, to become more fully myself. The moment stretched between them, weighted with unspoken emotions. Daniel reached for her hand, his calloused fingers gentle against her skin. "When this is over," he said quietly, "when the marshals have taken Harker away and things settle, we should discuss the future. Our future." The implication was clear, though delicately presented in the restrained manner of a man unaccustomed to expressing personal feelings. Karen felt warmth spread through her chest, a sensation of possibility opening before her like a door to sunlight. "Yes," she agreed simply. "We should." 3 days later, Territorial Marshal Frank Donovan arrived with 4 deputies to take custody of Harker and his men. A solidly built man with a no-nonsense demeanor, Donovan reviewed the situation with professional efficiency. "Judge Hammond briefed me on the Whitmore case," he informed Daniel and Reed as they stood outside the jail. "Quite a mess you've had here. This latest incident with Harker will be added to the official report." "What happens to Whitmore's legitimate property?" Reed asked. "The businesses, the land not obtained through fraud. In the absence of legal heirs, it reverts to territorial control," Donovan explained, though given the circumstances, the governor might be persuaded to allow the town council first rights to purchase at a reasonable valuation. This news was received positively. Under Reed's interim leadership, the council had already begun discussing how Whitmore's holdings might be redistributed to benefit the community rather than concentrating power in a single individual's hands. As the marshals prepared to depart with their prisoners, Karen found herself standing beside Daniel, watching the procession of horses and the wagon that would transport Harker to Santa Fe for trial. "Is it really over?" she wondered aloud. Daniel considered the question thoughtfully. "This chapter is. Others will follow." He glanced down at her. "The question is whether we've learned enough to write them differently." Karen nodded, understanding his meaning. Removing Whitmore and now Harker had eliminated immediate threats, but the underlying conditions that allowed corruption to flourish remained. Economic inequality, racial tensions, the isolation of frontier communities from effective governance, these were challenges that wouldn't be solved by hanging one man or imprisoning another. "It will take time," she acknowledged, "and conscious effort." "And leadership," Daniel added. "People who remember the past but aren't constrained by it." Their conversation was interrupted by Marshal Donovan, who approached with final questions before departure. As they addressed these practical matters, Karen felt a growing sense of closure. The justice they had sought had been achieved imperfect, perhaps, but real nonetheless. That evening, the town gathered for an impromptu celebration in the square. Tables were brought outside, food, shared music played. It wasn't so much a celebration of Whitmore's death or Harker's capture. Karen realized as a reclaiming of community people, rediscovering connections long suppressed under Whitmore's divisive rule. She observed Mexican families mingling with white townspeople, sharing dishes and conversation with cautious but genuine goodwill. Elena's children taught American youngsters a traditional dance, while older men compared techniques for training horses or predicting weather. It wasn't perfect harmony, but it was a beginning. Daniel stood somewhat apart, never entirely comfortable in crowds. Karen joined him at the edge of the gathering, offering a plate of food. "You should be in the center of this," he told her. "You made it possible." Karen shook her head. "We all did. Even those who supported Whitmore initially, they chose differently when given the chance." They watched the celebration in companionable silence for a while. Then Daniel spoke, his voice low enough that only she could hear. "I've been thinking about what you said regarding your father's silver mine, your idea of fair wages and profit sharing. What about it? It would be challenging to implement alone. You'd face resistance from traditional mining interests, possibly sabotage. His expression was thoughtful. You'd need partners, people with experience in both mining operations and legal matters. Karen studied his face, understanding the unspoken offer. People like yourself. A slight smile touched his lips. Perhaps, if such an arrangement would be welcome. It would, she replied simply. Their conversation was interrupted by Reed, who approached with an urgent expression. Judge Mercer, Miss Dalton, I need your counsel. He explained that the town council was deadlocked on how to proceed with elections for a permanent mayor. Some wanted immediate voting, others felt more time was needed to establish proper procedures after years of Whitmore's manipulations. What do you think? Reed asked Daniel. Daniel considered carefully. Democracy requires both participation and preparation. I'd suggest a 3-month interim period, enough time to draft electoral rules, register voters properly, and allow candidates to emerge based on merit rather than mere ambition. Reed nodded thoughtfully. And who should oversee this process? The current council is tainted by association with Whitmore's regime. A citizens' committee, Karen suggested. Diverse in background, but united in commitment to fairness. Include representatives from all parts of the community: merchants, ranchers, laborers, Mexican residents. Reed's eyebrows rose slightly at the last suggestion, but he didn't dismiss it. That could work. Would you both consider serving on such a committee? Daniel and Karen exchanged glances, a silent communication passing between them. We would, Daniel answered for both of them. Though our primary focus will be rebuilding our homes. Understood, Reed replied. But your guidance would be invaluable even in a limited capacity. As Reed departed to present these suggestions to the council, Karen felt a curious mix of satisfaction and trepidation. They had committed themselves not just to personal reconstruction, but to community rebuilding, as well a larger responsibility than she had anticipated when she first stood against Whitmore. Second thoughts? Daniel asked, observing her expression. Not exactly, just awareness of the road ahead. It won't be easy. Daniel nodded. Few worthwhile things are, but we won't walk it alone. The simple reassurance steadied her. Whatever challenges lay ahead, they would face them together, not just the two of them, but this fragile coalition of townspeople who had finally found the courage to stand against tyranny and envision something better. As the celebration continued around them, Karen allowed herself to truly believe for the first time since her mother's departure all those years ago that belonging was possible, not through submission or silence, but through honest engagement with both the promise and problems of her home. Daniel's hand found hers in the gathering dusk, a quiet affirmation of shared purpose. Tomorrow would bring the hard work of rebuilding, of establishing new patterns to replace the corrupt old ones. But tonight, they could pause to acknowledge how far they had already come. The music swelled, people danced, and Dry Creek began hesitantly but genuinely to reimagine itself. The weeks following Harker's capture brought dramatic changes to Dry Creek. Under Reed's practical leadership and guided by the newly formed Citizens Committee, the town began dismantling Whitmore's corrupt systems and establishing more equitable arrangements. The saloon, once Whitmore's personal fiefdom, was purchased by the town and converted into a community hall with space for meetings, social gatherings, and a small library. Jenkins opened a school in one corner teaching children of all backgrounds, while Karen assisted when her rebuilding work permitted. The fraudulently acquired land was returned to its rightful owners, where possible, or allocated for community use, where the original owners had died or departed. The territorial governor, impressed by Judge Hammond's reports of the town's self-correction, provided modest funding for infrastructure improvements. Meanwhile, work progressed steadily on both Daniel's ranch and Karen's property. They divided their time between the two sites, with Daniel's home receiving priority due to the approaching winter. Miguel coordinated a team of skilled workers, many from the Mexican community, that had been marginalized under Whitmore's rule. By late November, Daniel's house had taken shape, a sturdy structure of timber and adobe, more spacious than his previous home but still modest by territorial standards. A stone fireplace dominated the main room, with large windows positioned to capture both morning and evening light. Karen's cabin had been rebuilt as well, though she spent increasingly little time there. Her days were occupied at Daniel's ranch, helping with construction during daylight hours, before returning to Elena's home in town for the night. This arrangement satisfied propriety while allowing them to work closely together. Their relationship had evolved naturally without dramatic declarations or hasty commitments. Daniel, still recovering from his wound and by nature reserved, expressed his growing attachment through actions rather than words, adjusting the height of shelves to better suit Karen's reach, crafting a writing desk for her use, incorporating design elements she preferred into the home's layout. Karen, for her part, brought life and warmth to spaces that might otherwise have remained austere. Curtains appeared at windows, quilts across chairs, herbs drying from kitchen rafters. Neither commented directly on these domestic touches, but both recognized their significance, a future being carefully, deliberately constructed. On a crisp December morning, Karen arrived at the ranch to find Daniel on the porch, examining a letter with a troubled expression. "What is it?" she asked, dismounting and securing her horse to the hitching post. Daniel handed her the letter wordlessly. It bore the official seal of the territorial governor's office in Santa Fe. "They're reopening the investigation into Whitmore's activities," Karen read aloud, "specifically regarding land transactions over the past decade." She looked up questioningly. "Isn't that good news?" "Read on," Daniel directed grimly. Karen continued reading, her expression growing more concerned. The letter requested Daniel's presence in Santa Fe, immediately citing inconsistencies in testimony and evidence from the Whitmore trial. It bore the signature of Alexander Grimes, deputy territorial prosecutor, a name unfamiliar to Karen. "Who is this Grimes?" she asked. "Someone new," Daniel replied, "appointed after we sent Harker to Santa Fe." He took the letter back, folding it carefully. "I knew Whitmore had connections in the territorial government. It seems they're making themselves known." Karen absorbed this troubling development. "They can't undo what's happened here. Whitmore was tried and executed with full legal authority." "True, but they can create complications for the future. Challenge property transfers, contest the legality of the Citizens Committee, possibly even bring charges against those who testified against Whitmore." Daniel's expression was grave. "This isn't over yet." The following day, Daniel departed for Santa Fe, promising to return as quickly as possible. Karen watched him ride away with a sense of foreboding that she couldn't quite explain. Though his wound had healed well, and he was more than capable of handling legal challenges, she felt vulnerable in his absence. Her concerns proved prescient 3 days later when a group of surveyors arrived from the Territorial Land Office, claiming authority to reassess property boundaries throughout the region. They began with Karen's land, specifically the area containing the silver deposit. "By whose order?" Karen demanded, confronting their leader as they set up equipment near the abandoned mine entrance. The man, a thin, officious fellow named Perkins, produced documents bearing the territorial seal. "Deputy Prosecutor Grimes has ordered a complete review of all property transfers affected by the Whitmore judgment," he explained with bureaucratic satisfaction. "There are questions about the legitimacy of your claim, Miss Dalton." "Questions. My family has owned this land for 20 years, so you claim," but our records show various liens and encumbrances that may invalidate your title." Perkins smiled thinly. "Just doing my job, miss. You can take up any concerns with the Santa Fe office." Karen rode immediately to town seeking advice from Reed and the Citizens Committee. They gathered hastily in the community hall, expressions grave, as she explained the situation. "It's a power play," Reed concluded after examining the surveyor's documents. "Someone in Santa Fe, probably associates of Whitmore's, is trying to regain control of the silver." "But the territorial court upheld my claim," Karen protested. "Judge Hammond himself validated the title." Jenkins, who had developed considerable legal knowledge through years of reading, shook his head. "Territorial law gives the governor's office authority to review judgments involving significant mineral rights. It's rarely invoked, but it exists." "So what do we do?" Karen asked, frustration evident in her voice. Elena, who had become an influential member of the committee, spoke up. "We resist legally, but firmly. The surveyors have authority to measure and document, not to seize property. We monitor their activities, document everything they do, and prepare our own case." Reed nodded agreement. "And we send word to Daniel in Santa Fe. He needs to know what's happening here." Karen drafted a detailed letter that afternoon, entrusting it to a reliable courier with instructions to deliver it directly to Daniel at the territorial offices. As she sealed the envelope, she couldn't shake the feeling that larger forces were aligning against them, that Whitmore's defeat had been merely the first battle in a longer war. Over the next several days, the surveyors expanded their activities to include other properties in the region, particularly those reclaimed from Whitmore's holdings. Their manner grew increasingly aggressive, removing boundary markers and challenging long-established property lines. Tension in the community rose accordingly. Those who had benefited from the redistribution of Whitmore's fraudulently acquired assets feared losing their newly secured rights. Others worried that the territorial government might impose a new administrator to replace Reed, effectively reinstating the old power structure under a different name. A week after Daniel's departure, with no word from Santa Fe, despite the courier's return claiming delivery of Karen's letter, the situation escalated dramatically. The surveyors, now accompanied by armed guards, began placing claim markers on Karen's property, specifically around the mine entrance. When Karen confronted them, Perkins produced new documents. "This land has been claimed by the Santa Fe Mining Consortium pending resolution of ownership disputes," he announced with evident satisfaction. "By order of the territorial court." "What court?" Karen demanded. "What judge signed this?" "Judge William Hammond." The name struck Karen like a physical blow. Hammond, who had presided over Whitmore's trial, who had seemed the embodiment of impartial justice, was now apparently supporting this blatant land grab. "I don't believe you," she said flatly. "Show me Hammond's signature." Perkins hesitated, then reluctantly handed over the document. Karen examined it carefully, noting the signature at the bottom. It appeared to be Hammond's, but something about it struck her as odd. The flourish at the end, too elaborate, the spacing between letters, inconsistent with other documents she'd seen him sign. "This is a forgery," she declared, her suspicion crystallizing into certainty. Perkins snatched the paper back. "Careful with such accusations, Miss Dalton. They could be considered defamatory." "Where is Judge Hammond now?" Karen pressed. "Called away on urgent business to Arizona Territory," Perkins replied smoothly. "Judge Simmons is temporarily hearing cases in Socorro." Another piece fell into place. Hammond conveniently absent, a new judge installed, Daniel summoned to Santa Fe, all while valuable property was being systematically reclaimed by mysterious interests. Karen returned to town, immediately gathering the Citizens Committee for an emergency meeting. As they discussed the increasingly suspicious pattern of events, Morton burst into the hall, his blacksmith's apron still tied around his waist. "Riders coming," he announced breathlessly. 20, at least well-armed flying territorial colors, but looking more like hired guns than lawmen. Reed moved to the window, peering out at the approaching horsemen. "This isn't right," he muttered. "Territorial marshals don't travel in such large groups without prior notice." Karen joined him, her heart sinking as she recognized the leader of the approaching force, a tall man with a distinctive scar across his left cheek. "That's Matthew Collins," she said quietly, "Pastor Collins's brother. He was Whitmore's enforcer years ago before Jackson. He left the territory after killing a man in a gambling dispute. And now he's back," Reed observed grimly, "with apparent official sanction." The riders entered town in formation, making a show of their numbers and weaponry. They stopped before the community hall, Collins dismounting with theatrical flourish. "Citizens of Dry Creek," he called loudly enough for his voice to carry throughout the town square. "I am Marshal Matthew Collins, appointed by the territorial governor to restore order to this community following the illegal seizure of property and the unlawful execution of Mayor Theodore Whitmore." Murmurs of disbelief and anger spread through the growing crowd. Reed stepped forward, his rancher's frame imposing despite his age. "We recognize no such authority," he stated firmly. "Mayor Whitmore was tried and convicted by a legitimate territorial court under Judge Hammond's supervision. His execution was carried out according to law." Collins smiled unpleasantly. "New evidence has come to light suggesting judicial impropriety. Judge Hammond has been temporarily relieved of his duties pending investigation." He unrolled an official-looking document. "By order of Deputy Prosecutor Alexander Grimes, all property transfers and governmental changes instituted following Whitmore's arrest are hereby suspended." "This is outrageous," Jenkins protested. "The territorial governor himself acknowledged our citizens' committee." "The governor has reconsidered his position," Collins replied smoothly, "in light of new information." Karen studied the man carefully, noting details that others might miss: the quality of his supposedly official uniform, too fine for a territorial marshal; the way his men positioned themselves strategically around the square; the barely concealed smirks on some of their faces. This was no legal action, but a carefully orchestrated coup. "Where is Judge Mercer?" she asked directly, causing Collins to focus on her for the first time. A flash of recognition crossed his face. "Ah, Miss Dalton, I was wondering when you'd speak up." His tone turned condescending. "Your friend is cooperating with authorities in Santa Fe. I'm sure he's being treated with all due respect for his former position." The implied threat was unmistakable. Karen felt cold fear settle in her stomach, but kept her expression neutral. "And Pastor Collins, is he aware of his brother's sudden elevation?" Something dangerous flickered in Matthew Collins's eyes. "My brother has chosen to retire to a monastery in California. His conscience, it seems, could not bear the weight of his actions against Mayor Whitmore." Karen didn't believe this for a moment. Pastor Collins had been instrumental in bringing Whitmore to justice, testifying despite personal risk. His sudden retirement reeked of coercion, or worse. Reed, sensing the deteriorating situation, attempted diplomacy. "Perhaps we could discuss these matters civilly. The Citizens Committee has maintained detailed records of all proceedings since Whitmore's trial. We're confident they would address any concerns about legitimacy." Collins waved a dismissive hand. "No need for discussion. My orders are clear. This town is now under territorial administration with myself as appointed overseer until proper elections can be arranged." His gaze hardened. "Any resistance will be considered sedition against territorial authority." With that declaration, he ordered his men to secure the community hall, the jail, and other key buildings. The citizens, outnumbered and unprepared for armed confrontation, could only watch as their hard-won independence was systematically dismantled. Karen retreated with Reed Jenkins Elena and other committee members to the apothecary shop, one of the few places not immediately occupied by Collins's men. As Jenkins closed the shutters against prying eyes, they assessed their desperate situation. "This is no legal action," Karen insisted. "It's a private takeover using forged territorial documents as cover." "Agreed," Reed said grimly. "But how do we prove it? Hammond is conveniently absent, Daniel detained in Santa Fe, and now Pastor Collins mysteriously retired." "We need to get word to Santa Fe," Elena suggested, "to the real territorial authorities." Jenkins shook his head. "Collins will have men watching all roads. No messenger would get through." Karen paced the small room, mind racing. "There's more happening here than just reclaiming Dry Creek. The surveyors, the mining consortium, Collins's return, it's all connected to the silver. Someone powerful wants that mine, and they're willing to overturn legitimate legal proceedings to get it." "But who?" Morton wondered. "Whitmore is dead. Jackson, too." "Someone behind them," Karen realized. "Someone who funded them, perhaps. A silent partner who's now claiming what they believe is rightfully theirs." Reed nodded slowly. "It makes sense. Whitmore always had more resources than a frontier mayor should. Someone was backing him, likely, the same interests now backing Collins." "We need to find Daniel," Karen declared with sudden certainty. "If they're holding him in Santa Fe, that's where the answers are." "That's over 100 miles through hostile territory," Jenkins protested. "With Collins's men controlling the roads, you'd never make it." "Not by the main roads," Karen agreed. "But I grew up in this region. I know paths that don't appear on any survey map." Elena stepped forward. "My brother Miguel knows them too. He can guide you." The others began to object, citing the dangers, but Karen's determination was set. "I'm not suggesting a frontal assault on the territorial capital," she explained. "But if we can reach Santa Fe undetected, find Daniel, and gather evidence of this conspiracy, we might have a chance to appeal directly to the territorial governor." After further discussion, they developed a plan. Karen and Miguel would depart that night, traveling cross-country to avoid Collins's patrols. Meanwhile, the committee would practice passive resistance, appearing to comply with Collins's authority, while secretly documenting his actions and preserving evidence of the town's legitimate governance. As darkness fell, Karen prepared for the journey. She dressed in men's clothing for easier travel, armed herself with a revolver Daniel had taught her to use, and packed minimal supplies that wouldn't slow her progress. Elena brought Miguel to the back entrance of the apothecary along with 2 of the fastest horses from Daniel's ranch. "They're watching the main roads and the trail to the ranch," Miguel reported. "But they're not familiar with the old Apache paths through the eastern hills." Karen embraced Elena briefly. "If we're not back in 2 weeks..." "You will be," Elena interrupted firmly, "with Judge Mercer and proper territorial authorities." After final instructions to the committee, Karen and Miguel slipped away into the darkness, keeping to back alleys until they reached the edge of town. They rode east initially away from the Santa Fe road before cutting north through a series of ravines and dry creek beds that offered concealment from possible pursuers. The night was clear and cold, stars brilliant in the December sky. Karen felt fear and determination in equal measure as they put distance between themselves and Dry Creek. Daniel was in danger. She was certain of it now. Whatever conspiracy had brought Matthew Collins back to power wouldn't hesitate to eliminate the former judge who had been instrumental in Whitmore's downfall. For hours, they rode in silence, Miguel leading with the confidence of someone who had traversed these unmarked trails many times. Just before dawn, they made camp in a sheltered canyon, allowing the horses brief rest while they ate jerked beef and drank sparingly from their canteens. "How well do you know Santa Fe?" Karen asked as they prepared to continue their journey. "Well enough," Miguel replied. "I worked there for 2 seasons before coming to Judge Mercer's ranch. The territorial offices are near the plaza, heavily guarded. Getting inside won't be easy." Karen nodded thoughtfully. "We'll need help from someone with access. I'm hoping Daniel has allies there, people who would recognize this coup for what it is." They rode through another day and night, avoiding settlements and keeping to less traveled paths. On the second evening, they spotted riders in the distance, a patrol flying territorial colors, likely some of Collins's men searching for anyone attempting to reach Santa Fe. Miguel led them into a dense thicket of piñon pines, where they remained motionless until the patrol passed. "They're watching all approaches," he observed grimly. "Someone is very determined to keep Dry Creek isolated." By the third day, the terrain changed as they approached the outskirts of Santa Fe. Adobe buildings appeared with increasing frequency, smoke rising from chimneys against the winter sky. They abandoned their horses at a small farm owned by Miguel's cousin, continuing on foot to attract less attention. Santa Fe sprawled before them, a mix of Spanish colonial architecture and newer American construction. The territorial capital stood prominently near the central plaza, its flag snapping in the crisp December wind. "We need information before approaching any officials," Karen decided. "Let's find somewhere to observe the Capitol building, see who comes and goes." They secured a room at a modest boarding house overlooking the plaza, claiming to be brother and sister traveling from Albuquerque. From their window, they could monitor activity at the territorial offices while remaining unobserved. Throughout the afternoon, Karen watched officials and visitors enter and exit the building, searching for familiar faces or anything unusual. Miguel, meanwhile, ventured into nearby cantinas, listening for gossip about recent events. He returned at dusk with valuable intelligence. "There's talk of a new mining operation being established in our region," he reported. "Backed by Eastern money, big money, the kind that buys territorial officials." "Any mention of Daniel?" Karen asked anxiously. Miguel nodded grimly. "He's being held for questioning in a fraud investigation. Not in the regular jail, but somewhere inside the Capitol building itself. Special arrangements, they're saying." Karen's concern deepened. Detained without charges in an irregular location, they are isolating him deliberately. "There's more," Miguel continued. "I heard a name connected to the mining operation. Ellsworth. James Ellsworth, Jr." Karen stared at him in shock. "Ellsworth. The son of the man Whitmore murdered 15 years ago." "The same. Apparently, he's recently arrived from New York with significant financial backing and territorial connections." The pieces began falling into place in Karen's mind. Ellsworth's son, grown now, and wealthy, returns to claim what he sees as his birthright, the silver his father discovered before Whitmore killed him. "But why work against you?" Miguel questioned. "Your father witnessed Whitmore's crime against his father. Wouldn't that make you allies?" Karen considered this carefully. "Perhaps he doesn't know the full story. Or perhaps he believes my father was complicit in covering up the murder by accepting Whitmore's hush money for years." She paced the small room. "Either way, we need to find him. He might be the key to understanding what's happening and to freeing Daniel." The following morning, their patience was rewarded. A well-dressed young man arrived at the Capitol in an expensive carriage accompanied by armed guards. Though he was too distant for Karen to discern his features clearly, His bearing and the deference shown by territorial officials marked him as someone of importance. "That's our man," Miguel confirmed after following the entourage at a discreet distance. "Ellsworth, Jr. He's meeting with Deputy Prosecutor Grimes right now." Karen made her decision. "I need to speak with him directly, without Grimes or other officials present. How he's surrounded by guards and never alone. He'll have to stay somewhere in town. Find out where a hotel private residence anywhere we might approach him more discreetly." Miguel departed on this mission while Karen continued watching the Capitol, hoping for some sign of Daniel or clues to his exact location within the building. Hours passed with no such indication, increasing her anxiety but not diminishing her resolve. When Miguel returned, his expression was triumphant. "Ellsworth is staying at the governor's mansion as an honored guest. There's a reception there tonight, territorial officials, mining investors, prominent citizens." "Perfect," Karen declared. "We need appropriate clothing and an invitation or a way past those who check invitations." Miguel smiled slightly. "My cousin's wife works in the mansion kitchens. Service entrance is at the rear, minimally guarded. Staff will be coming and going all evening." The plan took shape quickly. Miguel would enter through the service entrance posing as a kitchen worker. Karen would accompany him as far as the mansion, then find her own way inside, not through service areas where her unfamiliarity might raise suspicions, but through a side entrance Miguel identified as less closely monitored. That evening, Karen exchanged her men's traveling clothes for a simple but respectable dress borrowed from Miguel's cousin. She couldn't pass for a wealthy society woman, but might be taken for a minor government official's wife or daughter, enough to avoid immediate suspicion if she were spotted inside. They approached the governor's mansion as darkness fell, observing the steady stream of carriages delivering guests to the front entrance. Lanterns illuminated the grounds, their light reflecting off fresh snow that had fallen that afternoon. Miguel disappeared around back, while Karen circled to the east side of the building, where a small door led to what appeared to be a library or study. She waited until guards at the main entrance were distracted by new arrivals, then slipped through the unlocked side door. Inside the mansion was warm and brilliantly lit, the sounds of music and conversation floating from the main reception rooms. Karen moved cautiously through the book-lined study, emerging into a hallway, adorned with portraits of previous territorial governors. She followed the sounds of the gathering, pausing at the entrance to a large ballroom filled with expensively dressed guests. Territorial officials mingled with business interests, all gravitating around a central figure, a man in his early 30s with striking features and an air of authority that commanded attention despite his youth. James Ellsworth, Jr. Even without introduction, Karen would have recognized him from the resemblance to the description of his father in the historical accounts of Whitmore's rise to power. Skirting the edges of the room, Karen observed Ellsworth carefully waiting for an opportunity to approach him without drawing unwanted attention. She noted Deputy Prosecutor Grimes nearby, a thin, nervous man who seemed to hang on Ellsworth's every word. Her chance came when Ellsworth excused himself from the main group, moving toward a balcony door for air or privacy. Karen followed discreetly, slipping onto the balcony moments after him. Ellsworth turned at the sound of the door, surprise registering on his face at the sight of an unfamiliar woman. "I don't believe we've been introduced," he said, his accent revealing Eastern education. "We haven't," Karen acknowledged, closing the door behind her. "My name is Karen Dalton." Recognition flashed in his eyes, followed by wariness. "Dalton, Henry Dalton's daughter." "Yes? And you're James Ellsworth, Jr., son of the man Theodore Whitmore murdered 15 years ago near Dry Creek." Ellsworth's expression hardened. "You're direct, Miss Dalton. A trait I appreciate, though your presence here is unexpected. As is your involvement in the recent upheaval in my hometown." Karen countered, including the detention of Judge Daniel Mercer and the appointment of Matthew Collins as a false territorial marshal. For a moment, Ellsworth seemed taken aback by her knowledge. Then his composure returned. "You've traveled a long way to make accusations, Miss Dalton. Perhaps you should consider your position more carefully." "My position is clear," Karen replied steadily. "I represent the legitimate government of Dry Creek, established after Whitmore's legal trial and execution for your father's murder, among other crimes." "Legal?" Ellsworth laughed bitterly. "Nothing about Whitmore's governance or its ending was legal. The man murdered my father, stole his silver claim, and ruled unopposed for 15 years, while your father drank himself into oblivion on blood money." The accusation stung, but Karen maintained her composure. "My father was flawed, yes, compromised by Whitmore's bribes and his own weaknesses. But in the end, he preserved evidence of your father's murder and helped bring Whitmore to justice." "Convenient redemption," Ellsworth observed coldly, "after 15 years of complicity." Karen took a step closer. "I understand your bitterness, but your current actions undermining legitimate authority, detaining an innocent man, employing someone like Matthew Collins, they make you no better than Whitmore himself." This comparison clearly struck home. Ellsworth's expression flickered with something like doubt before hardening again. "You know nothing of my motives or methods, Miss Dalton." "Then explain them," Karen challenged. "Help me understand why the son of a murder victim would ally himself with the same corrupt forces that protected his father's killer for years." Ellsworth studied her for a long moment, seemingly weighing his options. Finally, he gestured to a secluded corner of the balcony. "Very well, but I warn you, the truth may not be what you expect."